deep beneath our feet lies a world we've barely begun to explore, a realm of eternal darkness where sound behaves in ways that challenge everything we know about physics. In caves scattered across every continent, explorers have encountered voices that seem to come from nowhere and sounds that carry impossible distances through underground chambers. These aren't just echoes or tricks of the mind. These are documented phenomena, recorded by scientists, witnessed by researchers, and experienced by thousands of visitors who descended into the earth expecting silence, only to discover that some caves refuse to stay quiet. From ancient oracles in Greece where priestesses claimed to hear the voice of Apollo, to sacred burial chambers in England where the dead seem to whisper prayers, to natural cathedrals in Scotland that transform ocean waves into impossible symphonies, these underground mysteries have puzzled humanity for millennia. The Oracle Caves of Delphi, voices from the sacred chasm. In the shadow of Mount Parnassus, where ancient olive groves meet limestone cliffs, lies one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. For over 1,000 years, pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean world to hear the voice of Apollo speak through his chosen priestess, the Pythia, in the sacred chambers beneath the Temple of Delphi. But when French archaeologists first began systematic excavations at Delphi in 1892, they found something that challenged everything scholars thought they knew about the ancient oracle. The dig team, led by Théophile Homolol, expected to find the usual remnants of classical Greek architecture: marble columns, foundation stones, perhaps some ceremonial artifacts. What they discovered instead was far more puzzling. Beneath the temple ruins, they uncovered a complex network of natural caves and artificial chambers, all centered around a deep opening in the bedrock that the ancient Greeks called the chasm. Local workers on the excavation reported strange sensations when working near this crack in the earth: dizziness, euphoria, and most unnervingly, the feeling that voices were whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. The French team documented these reports with scientific skepticism, but they couldn't ignore the physical evidence. The chasm was real, exactly where ancient sources said it would be. More intriguingly, the limestone chambers surrounding it showed signs of deliberate acoustic engineering. The Greeks had carved the rock to create specific resonance patterns, turning natural caves into sound chambers that could amplify and distort human voices in remarkable ways. For the first time, archaeologists had physical proof that something genuinely unusual was happening in the underground spaces where the Pythia delivered her prophecies. The historical record provided a wealth of clues about the Delphic oracle, but many seemed to contradict each other. Ancient writers described the Pythia as a young virgin who sat on a golden tripod above the sacred chasm, breathing vapours that rose from the earth and speaking in the voice of Apollo himself. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century AD, wrote detailed accounts of the oracle's sessions, describing how sweet-smelling gases would rise from the fissure and transform the priestess into a conduit for divine wisdom. But other ancient sources told a different story. Some described the Pythia as an older woman, not a virgin, who delivered prophecies in perfectly clear Greek rather than the mad ravings that popular imagination preferred. These accounts suggested that the oracle was far more organised and rational than the mystical accounts implied. The priestesses were educated women who understood politics, geography and human nature well enough to offer advice that seemed divinely inspired but was actually based on careful observation and analysis. Archaeological evidence began to support the more rational interpretation. Excavations revealed that the oracle operated as part of a sophisticated religious complex, complete with administrative buildings, treasuries and living quarters for a permanent staff. The famous prophecies weren't delivered randomly to whoever showed up. Visitors had to pay substantial fees, wait for specific festival days, and submit their questions through official channels. The whole operation looked less like mystical communion with the gods, and more like an ancient version of a consulting firm. Physical examination of the cave system provided even more intriguing clues. The chambers beneath the temple showed evidence of careful acoustic engineering that would have allowed priests in hidden chambers to project their voices through the rock, making it seem as though the walls themselves were speaking. Water channels carved into the stone could have carried sounds from distant chambers, creating the impression that voices were coming from deep within the earth. The Greeks had clearly understood how to manipulate sound and create acoustic illusions that would convince visitors they were hearing divine voices. For decades, the prevailing scholarly theory was that the Delphic oracle was essentially an elaborate fraud. The archaeological evidence seemed to support this interpretation. The acoustic engineering, the administrative complexity, the careful control of who could consult the oracle and when. Many historians concluded that the priests of Apollo had created a sophisticated psychological manipulation system, using hidden chambers, acoustic tricks, and clever psychology to convince visitors that they were receiving divine guidance. This fraud theory gained additional support when geologists examined the sacred chasm and found no evidence of gas emissions. If there were no vapours rising from the earth, then the ancient accounts of the Pythia breathing divine gases and falling into prophetic trances had to be fiction. The whole story of supernatural influence could be dismissed as ancient propaganda designed to increase the oracle's prestige and income. Some researchers propose that the oracle's apparent success at predicting the future could be explained by political intelligence networks. Delphi was a neutral sanctuary that attracted visitors from all over the Greek world, making it a perfect location for gathering information about political developments, military preparations, and economic conditions. The priests could have used this intelligence to make educated guesses about future events, creating the impression of supernatural foresight through careful analysis of current trends. The fraud theory seemed to explain everything. The acoustic engineering allowed for voice manipulation, the lack of geological gas emissions ruled out supernatural causes, and the intelligence-gathering capabilities accounted for the oracle's political insights. For most of the 20th century, scholars were confident that they had solved the mystery of Delphi through rational analysis and scientific investigation. Everything changed in the 1990s when geologist Jaita Grotto decided to take another look at the geology beneath Delphi, using modern techniques that weren't available to earlier researchers. Grotto brought sophisticated equipment that could detect trace gases and analyze rock formations with unprecedented precision. What he found revolutionized understanding of the ancient oracle. The sacred chasm, it turned out, sat directly above the intersection of two major geological fault lines. The movement and pressure created by these fault systems had indeed created conditions for gas emissions, but not the kind that earlier geologists had been looking for. Instead of dramatic visible vapours, the fissures released small quantities of ethylene, ethane, and methane, gases that could produce exactly the psychological effects described in ancient sources. Laboratory testing revealed that these gases, when inhaled in small quantities, could produce euphoria, hallucinations, and the feeling of being in contact with supernatural forces. The doses would have been too small to cause permanent harm, but strong enough to create genuine altered states of consciousness. The Pythia wasn't acting. She was actually experiencing chemically induced visions that felt completely real to her. This geological discovery transformed understanding of the oracle's acoustics as well. The same fault systems that released gases also created unusual sound transmission properties in the cave system. Voices could indeed travel through the rock in unexpected ways, but this was due to natural geological features rather than deliberate human engineering. The Greeks had built their temple over a location where the earth itself created both psychological and acoustic phenomena that seemed supernatural. Chemical analysis of spring water at Delphi provided additional confirmation. The water contained higher than normal concentrations of the same gases found in the fault emissions, suggesting that anyone who drank from the sacred springs would also experience mild psychoactive effects. The entire site was naturally designed to create the psychological conditions that ancient visitors interpreted as divine presence. Even with these geological discoveries, significant mysteries remain about how the Delphic oracle actually operated. The gases released by the fault systems were present, but their concentrations varied depending on seismic activity, weather conditions, and seasonal changes. Some days there would be strong emissions that could induce powerful visions, while other days the levels might be too low to have any noticeable effect. Yet historical records suggest that the oracle operated on a regular schedule, delivering prophecies on specific festival days regardless of geological conditions. The acoustic properties of the cave system are equally puzzling. While natural geological features can explain some of the sound transmission effects, the precision with which voices seem to move through the chambers suggests a level of acoustic engineering that goes beyond what random geological processes should produce. Modern acoustic analysis has identified resonance patterns in the cave system that seem almost deliberately designed to create specific auditory effects. but no one can explain how natural processes could have created such precise acoustic properties. The relationship between the geological phenomena and the oracle's famous political accuracy remains unclear. Even if the Pythia was genuinely experiencing chemically induced visions, this doesn't explain how her prophecies managed to provide useful guidance for military campaigns, colonial expeditions, and diplomatic negotiations. The psychological effects of the gases might have made her feel like she was receiving divine wisdom, but they wouldn't have given her access to information about political developments in distant cities. Perhaps most mysteriously, recent attempts to recreate the oracle's conditions have produced inconsistent results. When volunteers breathe measured doses of the same gases found at Delphi, some report profound spiritual experiences while others feel nothing at all. The acoustic effects also seem to vary unpredictably. Sometimes voices carry through the cave system with crystal clarity, while other times they're absorbed by the rock without any unusual transmission. The site continues to produce unexplained phenomena, but not with the reliability that made the ancient oracle famous throughout the Mediterranean world. Modern visitors to Delphi still report unusual acoustic experiences in the caves beneath the temple ruins, and sensitive individuals sometimes describe feeling dizzy or euphoric when standing near the ancient chasm, suggesting that whatever made the site special for the ancient Greeks continues to influence people today, even if we can't fully explain why. Lascaux Cave, the gallery where ancient voices still echo. Marcel Ravidat was 18 years old in the autumn of 1940, living in the small French village of Montignac during the darkest days of the German occupation. Unlike most teenagers, Marcel possessed an unusual fascination with the limestone landscape that surrounded his hometown in the Dordogne region. He spent countless hours exploring the forests and rocky outcroppings, not out of boredom but driven by an inexplicable sense that the ancient landscape held secrets waiting to be discovered. His friends considered him eccentric, a dreamer who preferred scrambling through brambles and examining rock formations to the normal pursuits of village youth. Marcel's obsession with the local geology had begun years earlier when his grandfather, a retired quarryman, had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated underground chambers and hidden caves. The old man had filled Marcel's childhood with stories of ancient peoples who had once lived in these hills, leaving traces of their presence in places where modern eyes rarely looked. While other children played with toys, Marcel learned to recognize the rock formations that suggested hollows beneath, the patterns of vegetation that indicated underground water, and the acoustic properties of stone that could reveal hidden spaces. What set Marcel apart was not just his knowledge of cave systems, but his approach to exploration. Unlike the systematic archaeological expeditions that had begun mapping the region's prehistoric sites, Marcel explored with intuitive methods that seemed to blend scientific observation with something approaching mystical insight. He would spend hours sitting quietly near suspected cave entrances, listening for sounds that might indicate air movement or underground water flow. His friends joked that he could sense caves the way water diviners claim to detect underground streams. The war had intensified Marcel's connection to the landscape in ways he couldn't fully explain. As German forces occupied the region and normal life became increasingly restricted, the ancient caves and rock shelters offered him a refuge that connected him to something deeper and more permanent than the temporary chaos of military occupation. In the hidden chambers beneath the earth, Marcel found a sense of continuity that transcended the immediate dangers and uncertainties of wartime France. On September 8, 1940, Marcel was walking through the woods near Montignac when his dog Robot began behaving strangely near an area where a large pine tree had recently fallen. The dog was pawing frantically at a depression in the ground, whining and circling with an agitation that Marcel had never seen before. When he investigated, he discovered that the fallen tree had revealed a hole in the limestone bedrock. Not just a simple depression, but an opening that seemed to descend into darkness beyond the reach of daylight. Marcel felt an immediate and powerful compulsion to explore this opening, despite the obvious dangers of entering an unknown cave system alone. The hole was too narrow for an adult to enter easily, but Marcel was small for his age and possessed the kind of reckless curiosity that makes teenage exploration possible. More than simple adventure-seeking, however, Marcel experienced what he later described as a calling, an overwhelming sense that this particular cave held something of extraordinary importance. The opening whispered with the sound of air movement, indicating that the cave system was extensive and possibly connected to other chambers or surface openings. Marcel had learned from his grandfather that such acoustic properties often indicated significant underground spaces, but there was something about the quality of sound emerging from this hole that seemed different from other caves he had explored. The air carried what he described as a living sound, not just the echo of wind through stone passages, but something that suggested the presence of spaces designed for human occupancy. Marcel returned home that evening, but found himself unable to concentrate on normal activities. The cave entrance haunted his thoughts with an intensity that he later compared to falling in love. He couldn't explain why this particular opening seemed so significant, but he was certain that exploring it would change his understanding of the landscape he thought he knew so well. Against his better judgment and the warnings of family members about the dangers of solo cave exploration, Marcel knew he would have to return. The next few days were agony for Marcel, as he waited for an opportunity to organize a proper exploration. He needed reliable companions, adequate lighting, and equipment for safely navigating unknown underground terrain. But more than these practical considerations, he felt driven by an inexplicable certainty that the cave contained something that had been waiting specifically for him to discover it. On September 12, 1940, Marcel returned to the cave opening with 3 friends, Jacques Massal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Cuencas. Armed with improvised lighting equipment and rope, the 4 teenagers prepared to descend into what would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The entrance required them to slide feet first through a narrow opening and drop several meters into the darkness below, a terrifying prospect that would have deterred anyone less driven than Marcel. The descent was more harrowing than any of them had anticipated. The initial chamber was larger than expected, but the floor was covered with loose rocks and debris that made movement treacherous in the flickering light of their makeshift torches. As they moved deeper into the cave system, the passages narrowed and widened unpredictably, creating navigation challenges that tested both their physical courage and their ability to remain calm in the disorienting underground environment. Marcel found himself taking the lead not through any conscious decision, but because something about the cave's layout seemed intuitively familiar to him. While his companions struggled with the practical challenges of moving through the passages, Marcel experienced the strange sensation that he was following a path he'd walked before, guided by acoustic cues and spatial relationships that he couldn't consciously identify, but somehow understood. The cave's acoustics were unlike anything Marcel had experienced in other underground spaces. Their voices and footsteps created echoes that seemed to bounce between chambers in patterns that suggested a complex, interconnected system of rooms and passages. More mysteriously, Marcel began to hear sounds that didn't correspond to anything he and his companions were doing, soft whispers and murmurs that seemed to come from deeper within the cave system, as if other explorers were moving through adjacent chambers just beyond the reach of their light. As they penetrated deeper into the cave, Marcel's companions became increasingly nervous about the strange acoustic phenomena, but Marcel felt increasingly certain that they were approaching something of extraordinary significance. The whispers and echoes seemed to be drawing them toward a specific destination, and Marcel found himself making navigation decisions based on these mysterious auditory cues rather than visual landmarks. When Marcel's torchlight first illuminated the painted walls of what would become known as the Great Hall of the Bulls, the experience was so overwhelming that he momentarily lost the ability to speak or move. The cave walls were covered with images of animals rendered with such skill and artistic sophistication that they seemed to move in the flickering light. Galloping horses, charging bison, leaping deer, and massive aurochs painted with a mastery that challenged everything Marcel thought he knew about prehistoric human capabilities. But what struck Marcel most profoundly was not just the artistic achievement of the paintings, but their acoustic integration with the cave's architecture. As he moved through the chamber, he discovered that the painted animals were positioned at specific locations where the cave's natural acoustics created particular effects. When he spoke or made sounds near certain images, the echoes would return with tonal qualities that seemed to bring the painted animals to life, creating an environment where visual and auditory experience combined to produce something approaching a multimedia performance. Marcel realized that the cave had been designed not just as an art gallery, but as an acoustic theatre where ancient artists had combined painting with sound to create immersive experiences that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. The whispers and voices he'd been hearing throughout the exploration weren't random acoustic phenomena, but echoes of human activities that had taken place in these chambers thousands of years earlier. The cave's architecture amplified and preserved sound patterns in ways that allowed acoustic memories of ancient ceremonies to persist and replay under the right conditions. Moving deeper into the painted chambers, Marcel discovered that different areas of the cave created different acoustic effects that corresponded to different types of artistic imagery. Areas painted with hunting scenes produced sharp, clear echoes that might have accompanied ritual reenactments of successful hunts. Chambers decorated with more spiritual or mystical imagery created softer, more resonant acoustic environments that would have enhanced meditation or religious ceremonies. The revelation that transformed Marcel's understanding was the recognition that he was not just discovering ancient art, but experiencing an intact prehistoric performance space where visual and acoustic elements had been carefully integrated to create powerful psychological and spiritual effects. The cave wasn't just a repository of ancient images, but a functioning instrument designed to induce altered states of consciousness through the combination of artistic beauty and acoustic manipulation. Marcel's discovery of Lascaux fundamentally changed scientific understanding of Paleolithic human consciousness and creative capability. Before Lascaux, archaeologists generally assumed that prehistoric humans possessed limited artistic and intellectual abilities, creating simple cave paintings primarily for practical purposes like hunting magic or territorial marking. Marcel's documentation of the cave's sophisticated integration of visual art and acoustic engineering demonstrated that our ancestors possessed complex understanding of psychology, acoustics, and multimedia artistic expression. The acoustic properties that Marcel had intuitively detected during his initial exploration became the subject of extensive scientific investigation. Researchers discovered that the cave's architects had deliberately shaped certain chambers to enhance specific sound frequencies, creating environments where human voices would resonate in ways that induced trance states and enhanced group psychological experiences. This finding revolutionized understanding of how prehistoric communities used caves not just as shelter, but as sophisticated ceremonial spaces designed to facilitate spiritual and social bonding. Marcel's experience also contributed to new methodologies in archaeological exploration. His intuitive approach to cave navigation, which had seemed almost mystical to his companions, actually demonstrated sophisticated unconscious processing of acoustic and spatial cues that professional archaeologists began to incorporate into their training. The recognition that caves could preserve acoustic memories of ancient human activities led to new technologies for detecting and analysing sound patterns in archaeological sites. The discovery influenced broader understanding of the relationship between environment and human consciousness. Marcel's description of feeling called to explore the cave and his ability to navigate through acoustic cues suggested that human beings possess unconscious sensitivities to environmental factors that can guide them towards significant discoveries. This insight has influenced everything from archaeological methodology to theories about human intuition and environmental awareness. Most importantly, Marcel's transformation from village teenager to discoverer of humanity's earliest masterpiece demonstrated that profound archaeological discoveries often result from the intersection of scientific knowledge, intuitive insight, and individual dedication to understanding the hidden dimensions of familiar landscapes. His legacy continues to inspire explorers and researchers who recognize that the most significant discoveries often come to those who approach ancient mysteries with both rigorous methodology and openness to experiences that transcend conventional scientific expectations. Krubera Cave, Voices from the Deepest Dark. The journey to Krubera Cave begins in the remote Arabica Massif of Abkhazia, Georgia, where the Caucasus Mountains rise like ancient fortresses against the sky. This is a landscape that seems designed to discourage human exploration. Jagged limestone peaks shrouded in perpetual mist, forests of dark pine that muffle sound and conceal treacherous terrain, and weather patterns that can shift from brilliant sunshine to violent storms within minutes. The approach to what would become known as the world's deepest cave requires days of hiking through wilderness that has changed little since the last ice age. The path to the cave entrance winds through terrain that tells the story of millions of years of geological violence. Limestone formations twisted by tectonic forces create a maze of ridges, valleys, and hidden sinkholes that can swallow an unwary traveller without warning. Local shepherds speak in whispered tones about areas where the earth itself seems unstable, where sounds echo strangely, and where experienced mountaineers have reported hearing voices calling from directions where no other humans could possibly be present. The final approach to Krubera's entrance requires technical climbing skills and specialized equipment. The cave mouth sits on a steep mountainside, accessible only to those willing to rappel down cliff faces and navigate through boulder fields that shift underfoot. Everything about the surface approach seems designed to test the commitment and skill of potential explorers, as if the mountain itself is evaluating whether visitors possess the determination necessary to handle what lies beneath. Weather conditions around Krubera are notoriously unpredictable, with fog rolling in so quickly that visibility can drop to 0 in minutes. Experienced cavers have learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when conditions are right for safe exploration. The quality of light, the direction of wind through the limestone formations, and most mysteriously, the acoustic properties of the mountainside that seem to change depending on atmospheric pressure and underground conditions. Local guides insist that the mountain speaks to those who know how to listen, providing warnings about dangerous weather or optimal conditions for descent. The psychological impact of reaching Krubera's entrance cannot be understated. Standing at the threshold of what scientists now know is the deepest explored cave on Earth creates a sense of anticipation mixed with primal fear that even experienced explorers find difficult to describe. The opening itself is deceptively modest, a crack in the limestone that gives no hint of the vast underground system that extends over a mile beneath the surface. Yet something about the quality of darkness visible in that opening and the sounds that emerge from it immediately communicates that this is no ordinary cave. The initial descent into Krubera Cave reveals nothing extraordinary. Limestone passages similar to those found in caves throughout the world, worn smooth by water flow over geological timescales. Early Soviet expeditions in the 1960s mapped the first few hundred meters of the cave system, noting its potential for deep exploration but finding nothing that distinguished it from hundreds of other caves in the region. The first explorers encountered typical cave formations, underground streams, and the familiar challenges of navigation in complex three-dimensional spaces. However, even these early expeditions reported acoustic anomalies that would become central to Krubera's growing reputation among serious cavers. Team members working in different parts of the cave system reported hearing each other's voices with impossible clarity across distances and through rock formations that should have blocked sound transmission completely. Conversations that took place in chambers hundreds of meters apart seemed to carry through the cave's passages as if the limestone itself was conducting sound in ways that violated conventional acoustic principles. The cave's structure defied easy mapping from the beginning. Passages branched and rejoined in patterns that seemed designed to confuse navigation, while vertical shafts dropped into darkness beyond the reach of early lighting equipment. Most puzzling was the discovery that the cave's internal acoustics varied significantly depending on weather conditions on the surface, suggesting some form of connection between the deep cave environment and atmospheric changes occurring far above. Soviet cave maps from this period show a relatively modest system extending perhaps 400 meters below the surface, but expedition reports contain numerous references to unexplored passages that called to explorers with sounds that seemed to originate from much greater depths. Team members described hearing water flow, air movement, and most mysteriously, sounds that resembled human voices or equipment noise coming from areas of the cave that no one had yet explored. By the 1980s, it was clear that Krubera Cave was far more extensive than initial surveys had suggested. Expeditions using improved equipment and techniques began pushing deeper into the system, discovering that the modest entrance opened into a vast network of chambers, passages, and vertical shafts that seemed to extend indefinitely into the earth. Each expedition reported the same acoustic mysteries, voices that carried impossible distances, echoes that returned minutes after the original sounds, and most unnervingly conversations that seemed to be taking place in unexplored areas of the cave. As expeditions pushed beyond the 1,000-meter depth mark, Krubera Cave began to reveal acoustic properties that challenged basic understanding of how sound behaves in enclosed spaces. Team members reported hearing conversations between other expedition members with perfect clarity, even when separated by vertical distances of hundreds of meters and multiple rock barriers that should have completely blocked sound transmission. Radio equipment designed for cave communication began malfunctioning in specific areas, picking up transmissions that seemed to originate from within the cave itself, rather than from other team members. The cave's internal weather patterns created additional mysteries. Air currents flowed through the system in ways that defied the simple physics of pressure differentials, sometimes carrying sounds from deep within the cave up to surface areas, and other times seeming to absorb voices and equipment noise completely. Expedition members working in the deepest accessible chambers reported that their voices would sometimes echo back to them with different tonal qualities, as if the cave was modifying the sound before returning it. Temperature variations within Krubera proved to be far more complex than typical cave climatology would predict. Different chambers at similar depth showed significant temperature differences that couldn't be explained by known heating or cooling mechanisms. More mysteriously, these temperature variations seemed to correlate with the acoustic anomalies. Areas where voices carried unusual distances were often significantly warmer or cooler than surrounding passages. Equipment behavior became increasingly erratic as expeditions pushed deeper. Batteries drained at abnormal rates in specific areas, while electronic devices designed for cave exploration began producing readings that didn't correspond to known environmental conditions. Most concerning were the audio recording devices that occasionally captured sounds when no expedition members were present in the area, voices speaking in languages that expedition members couldn't identify, mechanical sounds that suggested equipment or construction activity, and acoustic patterns that resembled coded communications. By the time expeditions reached depths of 1,500 meters, team members were reporting psychological effects that seemed connected to the cave's acoustic properties. Experienced cavers who had explored cave systems worldwide described feeling disoriented, not by the physical challenges of deep cave exploration, but by auditory experiences that seemed to violate their understanding of reality. Voices of team members seemed to come from directions where no one was present, while sounds that should have been produced by expedition activities echoed through the cave long after the activities had ceased. At depths exceeding 2,000 meters, deeper than any other known cave system on Earth, Krubera Cave reveals its most profound mysteries. In the deepest accessible chambers, expedition members consistently report acoustic phenomena that seem to transcend normal physical laws. Voices spoken in these depths don't just echo, they seem to be processed and modified by the cave system itself before being transmitted to other areas of the cave. Team members describe hearing their own voices returning to them, speaking words they never said or conversations between expedition members that include statements no one remembers making. The deepest chambers of Krubera exist in a state of profound silence broken only by the distant sound of water flow and air movement. Yet this silence itself seems alive with potential sound. Expedition members report that the quality of quiet in these depths is unlike anything they have experienced in other environments. Not the simple absence of sound, but a pregnant stillness that seems to be listening, waiting, evaluating the human presence in spaces that have remained undisturbed for millions of years. Radio communication becomes impossible in the deepest areas of the cave, not due to simple signal blocking, but because radio equipment begins picking up transmissions that don't originate from expedition team members. These phantom communications include voices speaking in multiple languages, technical discussions about cave exploration equipment and techniques, and most mysteriously conversations that seem to be taking place in real time but don't correspond to any activity actually occurring in the cave. Water sounds in the deepest chambers create additional acoustic mysteries. Underground streams and dripping water produce rhythmic patterns that expedition members describe as resembling coded communications, musical compositions. These water-generated sounds seem to respond to human presence, changing their patterns and frequencies when people enter specific chambers. Some expedition members report that the water sounds seem to be conversing with their voices, creating call and response patterns that suggest some form of acoustic intelligence. The psychological impact of spending time in Krubera's deepest chambers is profound and consistent across different expedition teams. Experienced cavers report feeling that they are not alone in the depths, that invisible presences are observing their activities and responding to their conversations. While no visual evidence supports these feelings, the acoustic environment in the deepest chambers seems designed to create the impression of inhabited space, sounds that suggest movement, breathing and communication occurring just beyond the range of human perception. The ascent from Krubera's depths is often more psychologically challenging than the descent, as expedition members must readjust to normal acoustic environments after spending days in chambers where sound behaves according to unknown principles. Many cavers report that normal conversations seem strangely flat and lifeless after experiencing the acoustic richness of the deep cave environment. Voices that seem to possess almost magical properties in the depths return to ordinary human speech as teams approach the surface. Equipment that malfunctioned in the deepest chambers often begins working normally again as expeditions ascend, though analysis of recorded data reveals acoustic information that doesn't correspond to any sounds that expedition members remember creating. Audio recordings from the deepest chambers contain voices, conversations, and mechanical sounds that no one can identify or explain, suggesting that the cave's acoustic properties may preserve and replay sounds from previous expeditions, or even from unknown sources. The transition from the cave's internal acoustic environment to surface conditions creates a form of sensory adjustment that experienced Krubera explorers recognize as unique to this particular cave system. Other deep caves don't create the same acoustic disorientation during ascent, suggesting that whatever makes Krubera's sound environment so unusual is specific to this geological formation, rather than a general property of deep cave systems. Teams returning from Krubera's depths consistently report enhanced acoustic sensitivity that persists for weeks or months after the expedition. They describe being able to hear conversations and environmental sounds with unusual clarity, as if their experience in the cave has somehow modified their auditory processing capabilities. Some expedition members report continuing to hear faint echoes of the cave's acoustic environment in quiet moments, as if part of their consciousness remains connected to the deep chambers even after returning to the surface world. Scientific analysis of data collected from Krubera's depths has raised more questions than it has answered about the cave's acoustic properties. The recordings and measurements suggest that sound behaves differently in these extreme underground environments, possibly due to pressure effects, unique geological formations, or atmospheric conditions that don't exist in more accessible cave systems. However, the specific mechanisms that create Krubera's acoustic anomalies remain unexplained despite decades of investigation. Melissani Cave, Greece, the lake where nymphs still whisper. Spiridon Marinatos was not the kind of archaeologist who believed in supernatural phenomena, but the island of Kefalonia had begun to challenge his rational worldview in ways that troubled his scientific mind. By 1951, at the age of 49, Marinatos had already established himself as one of Greece's most respected archaeologists, famous for his methodical approach to excavation and his ability to separate historical fact from local folklore. His discovery of the Bronze Age settlement at Akrotiri would later cement his reputation, but it was his encounter with a flooded cave on Kefalonia that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the relationship between ancient Greek spirituality and the natural world. Marinatos had come to Kefalonia to investigate reports of Mycenaean artifacts discovered by local fishermen, but he found himself increasingly drawn to the island's extensive network of underground water systems. Unlike the dry, sun-baked landscapes of most Greek archaeological sites, Kefalonia's interior was carved by underground rivers and flooded chambers that created an otherworldly environment reminiscent of the mythological underworld described in ancient texts. As a scholar of ancient Greek religion, Marinatos understood that water played a crucial role in Greek spiritual practice, but he had never encountered a landscape where the boundary between mythological description and physical reality seemed so permeable. What set Marinatos apart from other archaeologists of his era was his willingness to consider the psychological and spiritual dimensions of ancient sites rather than focusing solely on material artifacts. He had begun to suspect that many Greek religious practices were based on sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that modern science had not yet fully explained. His approach to archaeology included careful attention to the acoustic properties of ancient temples, the astronomical alignments of sacred sites, and the ways that natural environments might have been used to induce specific psychological states in religious practitioners. The island's local population regarded Marinatos with a mixture of respect and wariness. They appreciated his scholarly credentials and his respectful approach to their traditions, but they also sensed that he was searching for something beyond the usual concerns of academic archaeology. Village elders spoke of him as a man who listened too carefully to old stories, who asked too many questions about places that local people preferred to leave undisturbed, and who seemed to understand that some mysteries were better experienced than explained. In the summer of 1951, Marinatos heard his first account of the Melissani Cave from an elderly fisherman named Dimitris Kastanoudakis, who described it as a place where the old gods still speak to those who know how to listen. According to Dimitris, the cave contained an underground lake of impossible beauty, where ancient Greeks had once worshipped water spirits called nymphs. More intriguingly, the fisherman insisted that visitors to the cave still reported hearing voices across the water, conversations in ancient Greek that seemed to come from the lake itself, rather than from other people. Marinatos initially dismissed these accounts as typical folklore, the kind of supernatural embellishment that rural communities often attach to unusual natural features. However, as he gathered more testimonies from local residents, he began to detect consistencies in their descriptions that suggested genuine acoustic phenomena rather than simple imagination. Multiple witnesses described similar experiences, voices that seemed to emanate from the water itself, conversations that could be heard clearly across the lake but couldn't be traced to any visible source, and most mysteriously, the sensation that invisible presences were responding to spoken words with replies that seemed to demonstrate intelligence and awareness. The fisherman's description of the cave's physical characteristics also intrigued Marinatos from an archaeological perspective. Dimitris spoke of carved stone platforms around the lake's edge, pottery shards embedded in the cave walls, and what appeared to be deliberate modifications to the cave's natural acoustics that enhanced the transmission of sound across the water. If these details were accurate, they suggested that Melissani Cave had been used as a sacred site in antiquity, possibly as a shrine to the water nymphs that figured prominently in ancient Greek religious practice. What truly convinced Marinatos to investigate the cave was not the supernatural claims but the acoustic descriptions. As someone who had studied the sophisticated acoustic engineering of ancient Greek theatres and temples, he recognized that the Greeks possessed advanced understanding of how sound could be manipulated to create specific psychological effects. If Melissani Cave really did contain natural or modified acoustic properties that created the impression of supernatural voices, it could provide valuable insights into how ancient Greeks integrated natural phenomena into their religious practices. The calling to explore Melissani Cave became irresistible when Marinatos realized that no systematic archaeological investigation had ever been conducted at the site, despite its obvious potential significance. Here was a location that combined unusual natural phenomena with possible ancient religious usage, offering the chance to study how Greek spiritual practices might have been influenced by specific environmental conditions that create experiences interpreted as divine communication. Reaching Melissani Cave required a journey through terrain that seemed designed to test the determination of potential visitors. The cave entrance was located in a remote area of Kefalonia, accessible only by footpaths that wound through dense Mediterranean scrubland and limestone formations that concealed sudden drops and hidden crevices. Local guides were reluctant to lead visitors to the cave, not due to physical dangers but because of deeply held beliefs about the site's sacred nature and the potential consequences of disturbing the spirits that were said to inhabit the underground lake. When Marinatos finally reached the cave entrance in late summer 1951, he understood immediately why the site had acquired such a powerful reputation among local residents. The opening in the limestone revealed a chamber of extraordinary beauty, with crystal clear water reflecting light that filtered down through a partially collapsed ceiling. The quality of light within the cave created an almost ethereal atmosphere, with blues and greens that seemed too intense to be natural, as if the water itself was generating illumination rather than simply reflecting it. The acoustic properties of the cave were immediately apparent and deeply unsettling. Marinatos' footsteps around the lake's edge created echoes that seemed to bounce between the walls for an impossibly long time, while his voice carried across the water with a clarity and resonance that suggested the cave's architecture had been specifically designed to enhance sound transmission. More mysteriously, he began to detect sounds that didn't correspond to his own activities, soft whispers and murmurs that seemed to emanate from the water itself. creating the impression that invisible presences were commenting on his exploration. As Marinatos spent more time in the cave, he began to experience the acoustic phenomena that local residents had described. Voices seemed to emerge from the water, speaking in what sounded like archaic Greek, but remaining just at the edge of intelligibility. The voices appeared to respond to his presence, becoming more distinct when he sat quietly by the water and fading when he moved around the cave. Most unnervingly, the voices seemed to be engaged in conversations with each other, discussing topics that Marinatos couldn't quite understand, but that seemed to concern his presence in the sacred space. The psychological impact of prolonged exposure to the cave's environment was profound and unexpected. Marinatos found himself entering altered states of consciousness that he'd never experienced at other archaeological sites, feeling as though he was witnessing ancient religious ceremonies that had taken place in the cave centuries earlier. The boundary between scholarly observation and personal spiritual experience began to blur in ways that challenged his scientific methodology and forced him to question the assumptions that had guided his academic career. The breakthrough in Marinatos' understanding came during his third extended visit to Melissani Cave, when he realized that the acoustic phenomena he'd been experiencing were not supernatural manifestations, but sophisticated applications of natural acoustic principles that ancient Greeks had recognized and utilized for religious purposes. The cave's unique architecture created specific resonance patterns that could transform ordinary sounds, the movement of water, air currents, even human breathing, into effects that seemed to demonstrate the presence of invisible intelligences. By conducting systematic acoustic experiments within the cave, Marinatos discovered that the positioning of ancient stone platforms around the lake corresponded precisely to locations where the cave's natural acoustics created optimal conditions for sound transmission and modification. Ancient Greeks had identified these acoustic sweet spots and constructed ritual spaces that would enhance the mysterious voice phenomena, creating a religious environment where worshippers could experience direct communication with the nymphs they believed inhabited the underground waters. The revelation that transformed Marinatos' understanding was the recognition that ancient Greek religious practices were often based on sophisticated, empirical observation of natural phenomena, rather than simple superstition or primitive thinking. The Greeks had studied the acoustic properties of Melissani Cave with the same systematic approach that they applied to architecture, mathematics, and astronomy, developing religious rituals that utilized natural acoustic effects to create profound psychological and spiritual experiences for participants. Analyzing the pottery fragments and carved stone features he found in the cave, Marinatos realized that Melissani had been used continuously as a sacred site for over 1,000 years, with each generation of worshippers adding refinements to the acoustic architecture that enhanced the cave's mysterious properties. The site represented not just a place where ancient Greeks practiced religion, but a laboratory where they developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors could be manipulated to induce specific states of consciousness. Perhaps most significantly, Marinatos began to understand that his own experiences in the cave, the altered states of consciousness, the sense of communication with invisible presences, the profound emotional responses to the underground environment, were not signs of scientific weakness or imagination, but evidence that ancient Greek religious technologies were still functional after millennia. The cave continued to produce the same psychological effects that had made it sacred to ancient worshippers, demonstrating the enduring power of environments specifically designed to facilitate transcendent experiences. Marinatos' investigation of Melissani Cave fundamentally changed archaeological understanding of ancient Greek religious practices and the relationship between natural phenomena and spiritual experience. His documentation of the cave's acoustic properties provided the first scientific evidence that Greek sacred sites were often chosen and modified based on sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors could enhance religious consciousness. This insight revolutionized the study of ancient Greek temples, theatres, and oracles, revealing that many sites previously dismissed as simply beautiful or symbolically significant actually possessed measurable physical properties that could induce altered states of consciousness. The acoustic research that Marinatos initiated at Melissani Cave led to the development of new archaeological methodologies that incorporated acoustic analysis as a standard component of sacred site investigation. researchers began to recognize that ancient religious practices often involved complex interactions between human consciousness and environmental conditions that modern science was only beginning to understand. This approach has since been applied to sacred sites throughout the Mediterranean world, revealing consistent patterns of acoustic engineering that demonstrate the sophistication of ancient spiritual technologies. Marinatos's personal transformation during his time at Melissani Cave also influenced his approach to other archaeological projects, leading him to pay greater attention to the experiential dimensions of ancient sites rather than focusing solely on material artifacts. His later work at Akrotiri and other Bronze Age sites incorporated insights about the relationship between environment and consciousness that had emerged from his study of the cave, contributing to a more holistic understanding of how ancient peoples understood and manipulated their physical surroundings. The scientific validation of acoustic phenomena at Melissani Cave has had broader implications for understanding the relationship between natural environments and human consciousness. Researchers in fields ranging from neuroscience to environmental psychology have studied the cave's effects on visitors, contributing to growing scientific interest in how specific acoustic environments can influence mental states, emotional responses, and even physiological processes. This research has practical applications in areas such as therapeutic environment design, meditation practices, and the development of spaces intended to facilitate healing or spiritual growth. Mammoth Cave, USA, the Echo River's Impossible Voices. In 1838, Franklin Gorin purchased Mammoth Cave and the surrounding Kentucky farmland, with the intention of developing what he believed would become America's premier tourist attraction. Gorin was a practical businessman who understood that the cave's vast chambers and intricate passages would appeal to the growing number of wealthy Americans seeking spectacular natural wonders to explore. What he hadn't anticipated was that his investment would thrust him into the center of one of the 19th century's most puzzling acoustic mysteries, a phenomenon that would attract not only tourists, but scientists, spiritualists, and investigators who came seeking explanations for voices that seemed to travel impossible distances through solid rock. The mystery first came to Gorin's attention through his tour guide, Stephen Bishop, an enslaved man whose intimate knowledge of the cave system surpassed that of any other living person. Bishop had spent years mapping Mammoth Cave's labyrinthine passages, discovering new chambers and underground rivers that extended far beyond what early explorers had imagined possible. During his solitary expeditions into the deepest parts of the cave system, Bishop began reporting acoustic phenomena that defied rational explanation, voices that seemed to carry from one section of the cave to another across distances and through rock barriers that should have made such transmission impossible. Bishop's accounts were initially dismissed by visitors as the superstitious fears of an uneducated man, but when wealthy tourists began experiencing similar phenomena during guided tours, the cave's mysterious voices could no longer be ignored. Guests reported hearing conversations between other tour groups that were supposedly miles away in different sections of the cave system. More mysteriously, some visitors claimed to hear voices speaking in areas of the cave where no other people were present, conversations that seemed to be taking place in chambers that had been sealed off or were completely inaccessible to tourists. The phenomenon became impossible to dismiss when multiple independent witnesses began reporting remarkably consistent experiences. Tour groups exploring the section of cave known as Echo River, an underground waterway that Stephen Bishop had discovered in the cave's deepest accessible regions, regularly heard what sounded like other tourists engaged in normal conversation, complete with guides explaining cave formations and visitors asking questions about the underground environment. However, when these tour groups attempted to locate the source of the voices, they found only empty chambers and the sound of water moving through darkness. By 1840, Mammoth Cave's phantom voices had become part of the standard tourist experience, with visitors coming specifically to witness the acoustic mystery that newspaper accounts were describing as either a remarkable natural phenomenon or evidence of supernatural activity in America's longest cave system. Gorin realized that whatever was causing the voices, it was attracting paying customers who were eager to experience something that challenged their understanding of how sound behaved in underground environments. The first systematic investigation of Mammoth Cave's acoustic mysteries began in 1842 when Dr. John Croghan, a Louisville physician who had purchased the cave from Gorin, commissioned detailed surveys of the cave system's layout and acoustic properties. Croghan was particularly interested in the relationship between the cave's physical structure and the reported voice phenomena, suspecting that unusual geological formations might be creating acoustic effects that visitors were interpreting as supernatural communication. The surveys revealed that Mammoth Cave was far more complex than anyone had previously realised, with over 400 miles of mapped passages connecting chambers at multiple levels throughout the limestone formation. The Echo River, where most of the mysterious voices were reported, flowed through a series of interconnected chambers that extended for miles underground, creating a potential acoustic network that could theoretically carry sounds across vast distances through this cave system. Historical research uncovered intriguing clues about the cave's acoustic properties in accounts from early American settlers and Native American traditions. Cherokee oral histories described Mammoth Cave as a place where the spirits of the earth speak to those who listen with proper reverence, while early European explorers had noted strange echoes and voices in their journals without understanding the significance of what they were experiencing. These historical accounts suggested that the voice phenomena had been occurring for centuries, long before the cave became a commercial tourist attraction. Physical evidence collected during the surveys included detailed measurements of chamber dimensions, water flow patterns, and rock formations that might influence sound transmission. Investigators discovered that the limestone walls of many chambers had been carved by water flow into shapes that seemed almost designed to focus and amplify sound waves. The Echo River itself flowed through passages that created natural acoustic channels with smooth rock surfaces that could potentially carry sound waves much farther than normal cave acoustics would predict. Temperature and humidity measurements revealed another layer of complexity in the cave's acoustic environment. Different sections of the cave maintained remarkably different atmospheric conditions, with some chambers significantly warmer or cooler than others at similar depths. These temperature variations created air currents and density differences that could potentially influence how sound waves travelled through the cave system, providing a physical mechanism that might explain some of the mysterious voice transmission. Witness testimonies from tour guides, tourists, and cave researchers created a detailed picture of when and where the voice phenomena occurred most frequently. The mysterious voices were most commonly reported during specific weather conditions, particularly when barometric pressure was changing rapidly due to approaching storms. Visitors also noted that the voices seemed clearest during certain times of day and seasons of the year, suggesting that external environmental factors were influencing the cave's internal acoustic conditions. The first major theory proposed to explain Mammoth Cave's voice phenomena focused on simple sound reflection and echo effects. Scientists in the 1840s suggested that the voices tourists were hearing were normal conversations between other tour groups, carried through the cave system by complex patterns of echoes bouncing off limestone walls. This echo theory seemed to explain why the voices often sounded like typical tourist conversations and why they were most commonly heard in areas with substantial rock formations that could create multiple sound reflections. However, careful testing of the echo theory revealed significant problems. Investigators positioned people in different parts of the cave system and attempted to trace how their voices travelled through the passages. While normal echoes did occur, they couldn't account for the clarity and apparent proximity of the mysterious voices that visitors reported hearing. The echo theory also failed to explain why voices sometimes seemed to come from completely empty areas of the cave, or why conversations could be heard that included information about cave features that the listeners hadn't yet encountered. A second theory focused on the possibility that sound waves were travelling through the cave's water systems rather than through air passages. The Echo River and other underground streams could potentially carry sound vibrations through the limestone bedrock, creating a form of underwater acoustic transmission that could make voices appear to originate from unexpected locations. This water transmission theory was appealing because it could explain how voices might travel across the vast distances involved in the cave system. Testing of the water transmission theory involved dropping sound sources into various parts of the underground river system and attempting to detect them at distant locations. While some sound transmission through water was observed, it was generally too distorted and low volume to account for the clear, intelligible conversations that visitors regularly reported hearing. The theory also couldn't explain why the mysterious voices seemed to respond to environmental conditions like barometric pressure and temperature changes that shouldn't significantly affect underwater sound transmission. The most persistent false lead involved supernatural explanations that attributed the voices to ghosts, spirits, or other paranormal phenomena. Various spiritualist investigators visited Mammoth Cave throughout the 19th century, claiming to detect the presence of deceased individuals who were attempting to communicate with the living through the cave's unique acoustic environment. These paranormal theories gained popular support because they seemed to explain some of the more mysterious aspects of the voice phenomena, such as conversations that included historically accurate information about past events or people. The breakthrough in understanding Mammoth Cave's acoustic mysteries came in the 1960s, when acoustic engineers used modern sound analysis equipment to study how voices actually travelled through the cave system. High-quality recording equipment and acoustic mapping techniques revealed that the cave's limestone formations were creating acoustic waveguides, natural channels that could carry sound waves across much greater distances than normal air transmission would allow. The key discovery was that Mammoth Cave's geological structure included numerous natural acoustic channels formed by water erosion patterns that had carved the limestone into shapes that functioned like enormous speaking tubes. These channels, many of which were too small for humans to enter but large enough to carry sound waves, connected different areas of the cave system in ways that weren't apparent from conventional mapping. Sound waves could enter these natural waveguides in one chamber and emerge in a completely different area of the cave, creating the impression that voices were coming from empty spaces or impossible locations. Advanced acoustic analysis also revealed that the cave's internal atmosphere created conditions that enhanced sound transmission under specific circumstances. Temperature inversions, humidity gradients, and air pressure changes could create acoustic focusing effects that concentrated sound waves and carried them much farther than normal atmospheric conditions would allow. These atmospheric acoustic effects explained why the voice phenomena were most commonly reported during certain weather conditions and times of day. Computer modelling of the cave's acoustic properties provided the final piece of the puzzle. Digital simulations of sound wave propagation through the mapped cave system showed that voices spoken in certain locations could indeed reach distant chambers through complex combinations of natural waveguides, atmospheric focusing, and acoustic reflection patterns. The models predicted the specific locations where voices would be most audible and the environmental conditions that would optimize sound transmission, predictions that matched historical accounts of where and when the mysterious voices were most commonly heard. The technological breakthrough also revealed that some of the voice phenomena resulted from acoustic time delays created by the complex path that sound waves followed through the cave system. Voices could take several minutes to travel through the natural waveguides, creating situations where tourists heard conversations that had actually taken place much earlier, contributing to the mysterious nature of the acoustic experiences. This time delay effect explained why visitors sometimes heard discussions about cave features they were approaching, creating the eerie impression that the voices possessed knowledge of future events. Despite decades of scientific investigation, several aspects of Mammoth Cave's acoustic behaviour remain unexplained. The cave occasionally produces voice phenomena that don't correspond to any identifiable sound source within the cave system, suggesting acoustic mechanisms that current theories don't account for. These unexplained voices often occur during periods when no tour groups are present in the cave, yet recording equipment captures clear human speech that seems to originate from within the cave system itself. The relationship between external weather conditions and the cave's internal acoustics is more complex than current models predict. While barometric pressure changes and temperature variations do influence sound transmission within the cave, the specific patterns of acoustic enhancement don't always match theoretical predictions. Some of the clearest voice phenomena occur during atmospheric conditions that should actually reduce acoustic transmission, suggesting that unknown factors are influencing how sound behaves in the cave environment. The cave's acoustic properties also change over longer time periods in ways that aren't explained by known geological or environmental processes. Comparison of acoustic measurements taken decades apart shows gradual changes in the cave's sound transmission characteristics that might be related to subtle shifts in the limestone formations or water flow patterns. These long-term acoustic changes suggest that Mammoth Cave's voice phenomena may evolve over time, with new acoustic channels developing while others become less effective. Perhaps most mysteriously, some visitors continue to report hearing voices that seem to demonstrate knowledge of cave areas that are closed to the public or have never been accessible to tourists. These voices discuss cave features, historical events, and geographical details with accuracy that suggests either access to information that should be unavailable or acoustic transmission from cave areas that have never been systematically explored. While most voice phenomena can now be explained through natural acoustic processes, these anomalous cases suggest that Mammoth Cave's acoustic mysteries may not be completely solved. Modern acoustic monitoring equipment occasionally detects sound patterns within the cave that don't match any known source of acoustic energy, including voices, equipment noise, or natural cave sounds like water flow and air movement, leaving researchers with the intriguing possibility that America's longest cave system continues to harbour acoustic secrets that challenge our understanding of how sound, geology, and human consciousness interact in the deepest accessible spaces beneath the earth. St. Paul's Cathedral Crypt, England, Voices from the City of the Dead. For over 13 centuries, the grounds beneath St. Paul's Cathedral in London have served as sacred burial space, first for Saxon Christians who established the original wooden church in 604 AD, then for Norman nobles who built the great medieval cathedral, and finally for the distinguished dead of the British Empire who found their final rest in the crypts of Christopher Wren's Brock masterpiece. This unbroken tradition of Christian burial has created what church authorities have long recognised as something more than a simple cemetery, a vast underground city of the dead where the spiritual beliefs of countless generations have accumulated like sediment in the limestone chambers beneath the cathedral floor. Medieval Christian tradition held that burial within sacred ground created a special relationship between the living and the dead, allowing the souls of the departed to continue participating in the spiritual life of the church community. The crypts of St. Paul's were designed not just as storage spaces for human remains, but as active extensions of the cathedral's sacred architecture, with careful attention paid to acoustic properties that would allow prayers spoken above ground to reach the ears of the buried faithful below. Church architects incorporated specific features, arched ceilings, stone passages, and strategic openings that created acoustic connections between the main cathedral and the underground burial chambers. The tradition of hearing the dead at St. Paul's developed alongside the church's burial practices, with clergy and visitors reporting that voices could be heard in the crypts during certain religious ceremonies or at specific times of day. These experiences were not considered supernatural phenomena, but natural expressions of Christian theology about the communion of saints, the belief that death does not sever the bonds between faithful Christians, but transforms them into a different kind of spiritual communication. Church doctrine taught that the voices heard in the crypts were evidence of the ongoing presence of souls who had achieved salvation and remained connected to the earthly church. Canon law governing the cathedral's crypts specifically acknowledged the acoustic phenomena, with regulations about when and how the underground chambers could be accessed to ensure that living visitors would not disturb the spiritual activities of the dead. Traditional church services included prayers specifically directed toward the crypts, based on the understanding that the departed could hear and respond to the voices of the living. These practices created a liturgical framework that treated the cathedral's acoustic mysteries as integral parts of Christian worship, rather than curiosities to be investigated or explained. The gradual accumulation of burials over centuries created increasingly complex acoustic conditions in the crypts, as chambers filled with coffins, monuments, and memorial inscriptions that altered the underground space's sound transmission properties. Church records document how the acoustic phenomena evolved over time, with new voice patterns emerging as different areas of the crypts reached capacity and burial practices shifted to accommodate the growing number of interments. By the 18th century, St. Paul's crypts had developed a reputation throughout London for acoustic experiences that seemed to demonstrate active spiritual presence in the underground chambers. The first systematic external investigation of St. Paul's acoustic phenomena occurred in 1871 when the newly formed Society for Psychical Research dispatched a team of investigators to study reports of spirit voices that were being heard in the cathedral's crypts. The SPR approached the investigation with scientific methodology, bringing recording equipment, acoustic measurement tools, and careful documentation procedures to what they expected would be a straightforward debunking of religious superstition. The team was led by Edmund Gurney, a Cambridge-educated researcher who had made his reputation by applying rigorous scientific analysis to claims of supernatural phenomena. Gurney's team encountered immediate resistance from cathedral clergy, who viewed the investigation as an intrusion into sacred space and a challenge to established religious authority. Dean Robert Gregory argued that the acoustic phenomena in the crypts were matters of faith rather than science, and that subjecting them to experimental analysis would violate the spiritual dignity of the burial chambers. The Church's position was that the voices heard in the crypts were evidence of divine presence that should be experienced through prayer and contemplation rather than measured with scientific instruments. However, the growing public interest in the cathedral's acoustic mysteries, fueled by newspaper accounts of visitors hearing unexplained voices during tours of the crypts, created pressure for some form of official investigation. A compromise was reached allowing the SPR team limited access to specific areas of the crypts during designated hours, with the understanding that their research would be conducted respectfully and would not interfere with ongoing religious activities or disturb burial sites. The initial findings of Gurney's investigation were far more complex than either the scientific skeptics or religious authorities had anticipated. The team's acoustic measurements confirmed that the crypts possessed unusual sound transmission properties that could theoretically account for some of the reported voice phenomena. However, the investigators also documented acoustic experiences that seemed to go beyond simple sound reflection or transmission, including voices that appeared to originate from within sealed burial chambers, and conversations that seemed to respond to questions posed by living visitors. Most significantly, the SPR team discovered that the acoustic phenomena were not random occurrences, but followed patterns that correlated with religious calendar observances, cathedral services, and even specific historical anniversaries connected to individuals buried in the crypts. This temporal patterning suggested that whatever was causing the voices was somehow connected to the ongoing spiritual life of the cathedral, rather than being simple acoustic anomalies that could be explained through purely physical mechanisms. The late Victorian scientific establishment's response to reports from St. Paul's Cathedral was predictably dismissive, with prominent physicists and acousticians arguing that the spirit voices were nothing more than misinterpreted echoes, sound transmission through the cathedral's stone architecture, or psychological suggestion affecting visitors who came to the crypts expecting to hear supernatural phenomena. The Royal Society commissioned its own investigation in 1885, sending a team of engineers and physicists who approached the cathedral's acoustic mysteries with the assumption that rigorous scientific analysis would quickly reveal prosaic explanations for the mysterious voices. The Royal Society investigators focused on mapping the physical structure of the crypts and measuring their acoustic properties using the most advanced sound analysis equipment available in the 1880s. They documented the dimensions of burial chambers, the materials used in construction, and the ways that sound waves might travel through the complex network of passages and chambers that made up the cathedral's underground architecture. Their initial theory was that voices heard in the crypts were simply sounds from the main cathedral above, transmitted through stone walls and floors in ways that created the illusion of supernatural communication. However, the controlled experiments conducted by the Royal Society team produced results that challenged their initial assumptions. When they positioned speakers in various locations throughout the cathedral and monitored the sounds detected in the crypts, they found that normal acoustic transmission couldn't account for the clarity and apparent proximity of the voices that visitors regularly reported hearing. More puzzling, the team documented instances where voices were heard in the crypts when no services or activities were taking place in the main cathedral, suggesting sound sources that their acoustic models couldn't identify. The scientific skepticism was reinforced by the broader cultural context of the 1880s, when Charles Darwin's theories of evolution were challenging traditional religious explanations for natural phenomena, and the growing influence of scientific materialism made claims of spiritual communication seem increasingly obsolete. Many researchers approached the St. Paul's investigation with the predetermined conclusion that any acoustic phenomena in the crypts must have purely physical explanations, regardless of how mysterious or complex those explanations might be. The dismissive attitude of the scientific establishment created significant tension with cathedral authorities and the broader Anglican Church, which viewed the skeptical investigations as attacks on fundamental Christian beliefs about the afterlife and the communion of saints. This tension prevented full cooperation between scientific investigators and church officials, limiting the scope of research and creating an adversarial relationship that hindered objective analysis of the acoustic phenomena. The breakthrough in understanding St. Paul's acoustic mysteries came in the 1960s when advances in architectural acoustics and audio recording technology allowed researchers to conduct far more sophisticated analysis of sound transmission through the cathedral's structure. Dr. James Whitworth, an acoustician from Imperial College London, was granted permission to conduct comprehensive acoustic mapping of the cathedral using equipment that could detect and analyse sound frequencies that previous investigators had been unable to measure. Whitworth's research revealed that the cathedral's architecture had been designed with sophisticated understanding of acoustic principles that went far beyond what 17th century builders were thought to possess. Christopher Wren and his collaborators had incorporated acoustic features into the cathedral's design that created specific sound transmission pathways between the main sanctuary and the crypts below, allowing for the kind of acoustic communication between different levels of the building that church tradition had long claimed was possible. More remarkably, the investigation discovered that the crypt's acoustic properties were not accidental byproducts of construction, but deliberate architectural features designed to facilitate communication between the living and the dead. Stone channels carved into the cathedral's foundations created acoustic conduits that could carry voices from the burial chambers to the main cathedral and vice versa, supporting the traditional Christian belief that the departed could participate in ongoing religious services. The technological analysis also validated many of the specific acoustic phenomena that church authorities and visitors had been reporting for centuries. The crypts really did possess acoustic focusing effects that could make whispered conversations audible across large distances, and the burial chambers really did create resonance patterns that could amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. These effects were most pronounced during specific atmospheric conditions and times of day, explaining why the voice phenomena followed the temporal patterns that earlier investigators had documented. Perhaps most significantly, Whitworth's research demonstrated that the acoustic experiences reported at St. Paul's were consistent with architectural practices used in other major Christian churches throughout Europe, suggesting that medieval and Renaissance church builders possessed sophisticated understanding of how acoustic design could support religious beliefs about communication with the dead. The spirit voices at St. Paul's were not unique anomalies, but examples of acoustic technologies that had been deliberately incorporated into Christian sacred architecture. The integration of scientific understanding with traditional Christian beliefs about St. Paul's crypts has created a more nuanced appreciation for both the acoustic sophistication of historical church architecture and the empirical basis of certain spiritual traditions. Modern cathedral authorities acknowledge that the voice phenomena in the crypts result from deliberate architectural design features, while maintaining that these acoustic properties serve important spiritual functions that connect the living with the dead in ways that transcend purely physical explanations. Contemporary acoustic research at St. Paul's has revealed that the cathedral's builders possessed knowledge of sound transmission principles that modern acousticians are still working to fully understand. The precision with which acoustic pathways were incorporated into the cathedral's design demonstrates sophisticated empirical observation and mathematical calculation that challenges assumptions about the technical capabilities of 17th century architects and builders. The scientific validation of the crypt's acoustic properties has also contributed to broader understanding of how architectural design can influence human consciousness and spiritual experience. Research into the psychological effects of specific acoustic environments has shown that the sound conditions created in St. Paul's crypts can indeed facilitate altered states of consciousness that support contemplative and spiritual practices, providing a scientific basis for traditional claims about the spiritual significance of the underground chambers. Modern church services at St. Paul's now incorporate explicit acknowledgement of the acoustic connections between the main cathedral and the crypts, with specific prayers and musical performances designed to take advantage of the architectural features that create communication pathways between different levels of the building. This integration of scientific knowledge with traditional religious practice demonstrates how contemporary Christianity can embrace empirical understanding while maintaining core spiritual beliefs. The ongoing acoustic research at St. Paul's has also influenced the design of new religious buildings. with architects and acousticians working together to create sacred spaces that use sound transmission principles to enhance spiritual experience and community connection. The cathedral's acoustic mysteries have thus evolved from sources of conflict between science and religion into models for how traditional wisdom and modern knowledge can combine to create deeper understanding of human spiritual needs. The Singing Caves of Capri, Italy, nature's hidden orchestra. The island of Capri rises from the Tyrrhenian Sea like a limestone symphony frozen in stone, its dramatic cliffs concealing a network of sea caves that have mystified visitors for over 2,000 years. The most famous of these chambers, the Blue Grotto, attracts thousands of tourists annually to witness its ethereal azure illumination. But it is the lesser-known caves scattered along Capri's coastline that harbour one of nature's most perplexing acoustic mysteries. These hidden grottos produce musical sounds that seem to emanate from the rock itself, haunting melodies that shift with the tides, change with the seasons, and create harmonic progressions so complex that early visitors believed they were hearing the voices of ancient gods. The Singing Caves of Capri generate their mysterious music through interactions between seawater, limestone formations, and air currents that create acoustic effects unlike anything found in terrestrial cave systems. As Mediterranean swells enter the partially submerged chambers, they don't simply crash against the walls but set up resonance patterns that transform the caves into vast musical instruments. The sound ranges from deep organ tones that seem to emerge from the Earth's core to high, crystalline notes that ring like celestial bells. The musical patterns are not random but follow harmonic structures that suggest intentional composition, with themes that develop and resolve like movements in a classical symphony. What makes the phenomenon particularly mysterious is its temporal complexity. The caves don't produce the same music constantly but create different compositions, depending on tidal conditions, wave height, wind direction, and even seasonal changes in water temperature. During calm conditions, the caves might produce gentle, meditative melodies that seem designed to induce contemplation. When storms approach, the same chambers generate dramatic, powerful compositions that rival the complexity of human orchestral works. Some visitors report hearing musical themes that seem to tell stories, with melodic lines that suggest narrative development and emotional progression. The acoustic effects are not confined to single caves, but seem to coordinate across multiple chambers along Capri's coastline. Visitors exploring different grottos on the same day often report hearing complementary musical themes, as if the entire island's cave system was functioning as a single, massive instrument with multiple chambers contributing different voices to an overarching composition. This coordination across separate geological formations suggests acoustic mechanisms that operate on a scale much larger than individual cave chambers. Temperature and atmospheric pressure also influence the cave's musical output in ways that seem too precise to be coincidental. Local fishermen have learned to predict weather changes by listening to subtle shifts in the cave's musical patterns, while musicians visiting the island report that the caves seem to respond to human-generated sounds, creating harmonies that complement songs or instrumental music performed near the cave entrances. The first scientific attempts to explain Capri's singing caves focused on simple resonance theory, with 19th century acousticians proposing that the chambers functioned as massive organ pipes activated by wave action. This organ pipe hypothesis seemed logical. As seawater entered and exited the caves with tidal movements, it could theoretically create the air pressure changes necessary to generate musical tones, similar to how air blown through organ pipes produces specific pitches determined by the pipe's dimensions. However, the organ pipe theory quickly encountered problems when researchers attempted to predict the cave's musical output based on their physical dimensions. Traditional organ pipe acoustics suggested that caves of Capri's size should produce much lower frequencies than the complex multitonal compositions that visitors actually heard. The theory also couldn't explain why the caves produced harmonic progressions and melodic development rather than simple sustained tones, or why the musical patterns changed so dramatically with relatively small variations in wave conditions. A second early hypothesis proposed that the musical effects resulted from water flow through underwater passages and chambers that weren't visible to surface observers. According to this theory, the cave's apparent musical complexity was actually produced by hidden hydraulic systems where seawater moved through narrow channels, creating whistling or singing sounds similar to those produced by water flowing through pipes. The underwater chamber theory seemed to explain why the cave's music was so sensitive to tidal changes, and why the acoustic effects varied with wave height and ocean conditions. Geological surveys of Capri's limestone formations provided some support for the underwater chamber hypothesis, revealing that the island's cave systems extended far below sea level and included numerous passages that were completely flooded. If these underwater channels had the right dimensions and configurations, they could theoretically create the complex acoustic effects that made the caves seem to sing. The theory also explained why different caves seemed to produce complementary musical themes. They might all be connected to the same underwater acoustic network. A third hypothesis emerged from observations that the cave's musical patterns seemed to correlate with atmospheric pressure changes and weather conditions. Some researchers proposed that the singing was created by air movement through the cave systems rather than by water flow, with barometric pressure variations creating wind patterns that activated natural acoustic features in the limestone formations. This atmospheric theory suggested that the caves were essentially wind instruments on a geological scale, with the Mediterranean climate providing the air currents necessary to generate musical tones. The first systematic acoustic measurements at Capri's singing caves were conducted in the 1920s by Italian physicist Dr. Giuseppe Mercalli, who used primitive recording equipment to document the musical patterns produced by different caves under various conditions. Mercalli's recordings confirmed that the caves really were generating complex musical compositions, but the technology of the era wasn't sophisticated enough to analyze the specific frequencies and harmonics that created the acoustic effects. More advanced studies began in the 1960s when researchers brought spectrum analyzers and underwater recording equipment to Capri, allowing them to study both the airborne sounds that visitors heard and the underwater acoustic activity that might be contributing to the cave's musical output. These measurements revealed that the singing caves were producing sound across a much wider frequency range than surface observations had suggested, with underwater acoustic activity that was often more complex than the music audible above sea level. Water flow measurements provided crucial data about how seawater moved through the cave systems during different tidal and weather conditions. Researchers used sensitive current meters and pressure gauges to track water movement through visible cave chambers and to detect flow patterns in underwater passages that couldn't be directly observed. These studies revealed that water didn't simply flow in and out of the caves, but created complex circulation patterns that included standing waves, spiral currents, and areas of turbulence that could all contribute to acoustic generation. High-speed underwater photography allowed researchers to observe exactly how wave action interacted with the cave's internal structure during the musical episodes. These studies showed that the limestone walls weren't just passive surfaces reflecting sound waves, but were actively shaping water flow in ways that created specific acoustic effects. The rock formations included natural features, ridges, channels, and chambers that seemed almost designed to manipulate water movement and generate musical tones. Pressure wave measurements detected vibrations in the limestone formations that corresponded to the audible music, suggesting that the cave's acoustic effects involved resonance in the rock structure itself rather than just sound transmission through air and water. These geological vibrations occurred at frequencies that matched many of the musical tones visitors reported hearing, indicating that the island's limestone was participating directly in the music generation process. Seasonal monitoring revealed that the cave's musical patterns followed annual cycles that correlated with changes in water temperature, salinity, and ocean current patterns. The acoustic effects were most pronounced during certain months when Mediterranean water conditions created optimal resonance in the cave systems, suggesting that the singing was influenced by oceanographic factors operating on much larger scales than individual cave chambers. As experimental data accumulated, several competing theories emerged to explain Capri's singing caves. The acoustic coupling theory proposed that the cave's musical effects resulted from resonance interactions between multiple physical systems, the airspaces within the caves, the water filling lower chambers, and the limestone rock itself. When these systems coupled under the right conditions, they could create complex harmonic relationships that produced the sophisticated musical patterns visitors heard. The hydrodynamic oscillation theory focused on water movement patterns within the cave systems, suggesting that the musical tones were generated by oscillating water columns in underwater chambers and passages. According to this theory, tidal forces and wave action created rhythmic water movements that functioned like the liquid equivalent of organ pipes, with different chambers and passages contributing different frequencies to create complex musical compositions. A third theory emphasized the role of air compression and decompression as waves moved through the caves. The pneumatic theory proposed that the cave's acoustic effects were created by rapid air pressure changes as water alternately compressed and released air trapped in various chambers. These pressure oscillations could generate sound waves at specific frequencies determined by the volume and shape of air-filled spaces within the cave systems. The geological resonance theory suggested that Capri's limestone formations possessed natural resonant frequencies that could be excited by water movement and wave action. According to this theory, the island's rock structure was functioning like a massive musical instrument, with different geological formations contributing different tones to create the complex compositions heard in the caves. This theory explained why the musical patterns seemed to coordinate across multiple caves. They were all activating different parts of the same geological instrument. Some researchers proposed that the cave's acoustic effects involved nonlinear interactions between multiple sound generation mechanisms. The nonlinear acoustics theory suggested that when different acoustic processes operated simultaneously within the cave systems, they could create new frequencies and harmonic patterns that weren't present in any of the individual mechanisms. This theory explained why the cave's music was so much more complex than simple resonance or water flow effects would predict. Modern acoustic analysis has revealed that Capri's singing caves operate through a sophisticated combination of hydrodynamic, pneumatic, and geological resonance mechanisms working simultaneously. The caves function as complex acoustic systems where underwater water movements, air pressure oscillations, and rock vibrations all contribute to sound generation and modification. Advanced computer modelling has shown that the cave's limestone formations create acoustic focusing effects that concentrate and amplify specific frequencies while filtering out others, explaining why the musical output seems so refined and harmonically sophisticated. The underwater passages that honeycomb Capri's limestone foundation do indeed function as hydraulic musical instruments, with seawater flowing through channels of different dimensions to create different musical tones. However, the acoustic effects go beyond simple water flow sounds because the passages are arranged in networks that create acoustic interference patterns, interactions between different sound waves that generate new frequencies and harmonic combinations not present in the original water flow sounds. Air compression effects play a crucial role in the cave's acoustic behaviour, but not in the simple way early theories predicted. As waves enter the caves, they create complex patterns of air compression and rarefaction that vary with the three-dimensional geometry of each chamber. These pneumatic effects create acoustic resonances that change dynamically as water levels rise and fall, producing the shifting musical patterns that make the caves seem to compose new melodies in real time. The limestone rock itself participates actively in the music generation process, through what researchers now understand as structural acoustic coupling. The island's geological formations vibrate at specific frequencies when excited by water movement and wave action, contributing low-frequency tones that provide the harmonic foundation for the higher-pitched sounds created by air and water effects. This geological participation explains why the cave's music has such rich harmonic content and why it seems to resonate through the entire island. Modern measurements have confirmed that the cave's acoustic effects are indeed coordinated across multiple locations, but through underwater acoustic connections rather than mystical island-wide consciousness. Sound waves generated in one cave can propagate through underwater passages to influence acoustic conditions in other caves, creating the impression of orchestrated musical performance across Capri's entire coastline. Despite decades of scientific investigation, several aspects of Capri's singing caves remain unexplained. The caves occasionally produce musical patterns that don't correlate with any measurable environmental conditions, including wave height, tidal state, or atmospheric pressure. These anomalous musical episodes suggest acoustic mechanisms that current theories don't account for, possibly involving interactions between the cave systems and oceanographic phenomena operating on much larger scales than local wave action. The cave's apparent ability to predict weather changes through subtle shifts in their musical patterns continues to puzzle researchers. While some correlation between acoustic effects and atmospheric pressure changes has been documented, the precision and timing of these acoustic weather predictions exceed what current understanding of cave acoustics would predict. Local fishermen continue to rely on the cave's musical forecasts with remarkable success, suggesting acoustic sensitivities that science has not yet identified. The musical compositions produced by the caves sometimes include harmonic progressions and melodic developments that seem too sophisticated to result from random physical processes. While individual tones and simple harmonic relationships can be explained through resonance theory, the caves occasionally produce musical sequences that seem to follow compositional logic rather than acoustic physics, creating the impression of intentional artistic creation rather than mechanical sound generation. Seasonal variations in the cave's acoustic behaviour are more complex than current oceanographic models predict. The musical patterns change not just with water temperature and current conditions, but also with solar radiation levels, lunar cycles, and other astronomical factors that shouldn't directly influence cave acoustics. These cosmic correlations suggest that Capri's singing caves may be responding to environmental influences that operate on much larger scales than terrestrial weather patterns. Thunder Caves, Jamaica, where the storm god's voice still echoes. Dr. Marlene Campbell had spent 15 years studying Caribbean indigenous cultures, but it wasn't until 1987 that she encountered the mystery that would transform her understanding of the relationship between natural phenomena and human consciousness. Campbell was a cultural anthropologist from the University of the West Indies who had dedicated her career to documenting the surviving traditions of Jamaica's Taino people, working with elderly community members who still remembered stories and practices that had somehow survived centuries of colonization and cultural suppression. Unlike many academic researchers who approached indigenous traditions as historical curiosities, Campbell possessed an unusual combination of rigorous scholarly training and genuine respect for the spiritual dimensions of the cultures she studied. Campbell's background made her uniquely qualified to investigate the mysteries she would encounter in Jamaica's Blue Mountains. Born in Trinidad to a family that included both African Caribbean and indigenous heritage, she'd grown up hearing stories about the spiritual properties of natural landscapes and the ways that certain places could serve as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. Her academic career had been shaped by the recognition that indigenous knowledge systems often contained sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that Western science had overlooked or dismissed as superstition. What set Campbell apart from other anthropologists was her willingness to experience the spiritual practices she studied rather than simply documenting them from an outside perspective. She had learned traditional meditation techniques, participated in healing ceremonies, and spent extended periods in natural settings that indigenous communities considered sacred. This experiential approach to anthropological research had taught her to recognize the difference between folklore and empirical observation, between symbolic representation and actual phenomena that could be measured and studied. By the 1980s, Campbell had become increasingly interested in the acoustic properties of sacred sites, particularly locations where indigenous communities reported hearing voices, music, or other sounds that seemed to originate from the landscape itself. Her research had revealed that many sites considered sacred by Caribbean indigenous peoples possessed unusual acoustic characteristics, natural sound amplification, echo effects, or resonance properties that could create the impression of supernatural communication. She suspected that traditional spiritual practices had developed around empirical observations of these acoustic phenomena. Campbell's reputation among Jamaica's rural communities was that of a researcher who listened with genuine respect to traditional knowledge and who understood that some experiences required participation rather than just observation. Elder storytellers and traditional healers trusted her with information that they rarely shared with outsiders, including detailed accounts of sacred sites where the boundary between the natural and spiritual worlds seemed particularly permeable. In the summer of 1987, Campbell was conducting interviews with elderly residents of the Blue Mountains when she first heard about the Thunder Caves from Samuel Morgan, a 78-year-old farmer whose family had lived in the region for generations. According to Morgan, the caves were located in a remote valley where his grandfather had taken him as a child to hear the voice of Huracan, the Taino storm god, whose presence could still be felt in places where ancient spiritual practices had been maintained, despite centuries of cultural disruption. Morgan's description of the Thunder Caves was unlike other sacred site accounts that Campbell had collected during her research. He spoke not of symbolic or metaphorical spiritual presence, but of literal acoustic phenomena that could be experienced by anyone willing to make the difficult journey to the caves. According to his account, the caves produced sounds that resembled human voices speaking in what Morgan believed was the ancient Taino language, conversations that seemed to discuss weather patterns, seasonal changes, and other topics related to the natural world. What captured Campbell's attention was Morgan's insistence that the cave voices were not random phenomena, but followed patterns that correlated with weather conditions and seasonal cycles. He claimed that his grandfather had taught him to interpret these voices as a form of environmental monitoring system, with different acoustic patterns indicating approaching storms, changes in rainfall, or shifts in temperature that could affect agricultural activities. If accurate, this suggested that the Thunder Caves might represent a form of indigenous environmental science that used acoustic observation to gather information about natural processes. Campbell was also intrigued by Morgan's description of the psychological effects that the cave voices had on listeners. He spoke of feeling connected to ancestral wisdom while inside the caves, of experiencing enhanced sensitivity to natural processes, and of gaining insights into environmental patterns that he couldn't explain through normal observation. These accounts suggested that the Thunder Caves might facilitate altered states of consciousness that enhanced human ability to perceive and interpret natural phenomena. The calling to investigate the Thunder Caves became irresistible when Campbell realized that no academic researcher had ever conducted systematic study of the site, despite its apparent significance in local Taino traditions. Here was an opportunity to document and potentially validate indigenous knowledge systems that had been dismissed by mainstream science, while also investigating acoustic phenomena that might contribute to broader understanding of how natural environments can influence human consciousness and environmental awareness. Reaching the Thunder Caves required a journey through some of Jamaica's most challenging terrain, following mountain paths that had been maintained primarily by hunters and traditional plant gatherers who still used routes established by indigenous communities centuries earlier. Campbell's expedition, guided by Samuel Morgan and his nephew Marcus, involved 3 days of hiking through dense tropical forest, crossing rain-swollen streams, and navigating limestone formations that concealed sudden drops and hidden crevices. The physical challenges of the journey were intensified by psychological pressures that Campbell hadn't anticipated. As the expedition moved deeper into the Blue Mountains, away from roads and modern settlements, she began experiencing a profound sense of temporal displacement, as if the landscape itself was drawing her back into an earlier era when indigenous peoples had lived in direct relationship with natural forces that modern civilization had learned to ignore or control through technology. Morgan's behaviour during the journey added another layer of complexity to the expedition. As they approached the Thunder Caves, he became increasingly ceremonial in his interactions with the landscape, stopping to perform rituals at specific locations, speaking in what he claimed was traditional Taino language, and demonstrating knowledge of plant medicines and spiritual practices that he'd never mentioned during Campbell's previous interviews. It became clear that accessing the Thunder Caves required not just physical travel but participation in cultural practices that most academic researchers would consider outside the bounds of scientific investigation. The final approach to the caves involved descending into a valley that seemed acoustically isolated from the surrounding forest. Campbell noted that normal jungle sounds, bird calls, insect noise, wind through trees, became muffled and distant, replaced by unusual acoustic properties that made every footstep and spoken word seem amplified and significant. The psychological impact of this acoustic environment was immediate and unsettling, creating the sensation that invisible presences were listening to and evaluating the expedition's activities. When they finally reached the Thunder Caves, Campbell encountered conditions that challenged her ability to maintain scientific objectivity. The cave entrance was located beneath a limestone overhang that created natural acoustic focusing effects, while underground chambers extended deep into the mountain in configurations that seemed designed to amplify and modify sound. More disturbing was the immediate recognition that the caves really did produce acoustic phenomena that resembled human voices, sounds that were clearly not simple echo effects or water flow noise, but organized patterns that suggested communication or commentary on the expedition's presence. Campbell's breakthrough in understanding the Thunder Caves came during her second night at the site, when she experienced what she later described as the most profound acoustic phenomenon of her research career. Alone in the main cave chamber while her guide slept outside, she began to hear voices that not only seemed to speak in organized patterns, but appeared to be responding directly to her thoughts and questions about Taino spiritual practices and environmental knowledge systems. The voices did not speak in English, but in what Campbell recognized as consistent linguistic patterns that resembled the fragmented Taino vocabulary that survived in regional place names and traditional stories. More remarkably, the acoustic patterns seemed to convey specific information about weather conditions, seasonal changes, and ecological relationships that Campbell could verify through her own environmental observations. The cave voices appeared to be demonstrating exactly the kind of environmental monitoring capabilities that Samuel Morgan had described in his family traditions. The revelation that transformed Campbell's understanding was the recognition that the Thunder Caves were not producing random acoustic phenomena, but functioning as sophisticated environmental sensors that converted atmospheric pressure changes, humidity variations, and other meteorological conditions into acoustic patterns that trained listeners could interpret as information about natural processes. The caves were essentially natural weather stations that used acoustic output to communicate environmental data to human observers who possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to decode the information. Through careful observation and documentation, Campbell discovered that different acoustic patterns produced by the caves correlated with specific weather conditions and environmental changes. Low-frequency rumbling sounds preceded storm systems by several hours, while higher-pitched tones seemed to indicate changes in humidity or atmospheric pressure. The caves were responding to environmental conditions with acoustic output that could serve as early warning systems for communities that depended on accurate weather prediction for agricultural and survival activities. Perhaps most significantly, Campbell realized that her ability to interpret these acoustic patterns was being enhanced by the altered states of consciousness that the cave environment induced. The combination of acoustic effects, atmospheric conditions within the caves, and psychological preparation through traditional rituals was creating mental states that enhanced pattern recognition and environmental sensitivity. The caves were not just providing information, but also modifying human consciousness in ways that improved the ability to receive and interpret that information. Campbell's investigation of the Thunder Caves fundamentally changed academic understanding of indigenous environmental knowledge systems and the relationship between natural phenomena and human consciousness. Her documentation of the cave's acoustic weather prediction capabilities provided the first scientific validation of traditional claims about natural sites that could speak to human observers about environmental conditions. This research contributed to growing recognition that indigenous knowledge systems often contained sophisticated empirical observation techniques that mainstream science had overlooked. The acoustic research that Campbell initiated at the Thunder Caves led to broader scientific interest in how natural environments can influence human consciousness and environmental awareness. Her work demonstrated that certain natural settings possess measurable properties, acoustic effects, atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic fields that can enhance human ability to perceive and interpret environmental information. This research has practical applications in fields ranging from weather prediction to environmental monitoring and ecological restoration. Campbell's experiential approach to anthropological research also influenced methodological discussions in academic circles about the relationship between scientific objectivity and cultural participation. Her work at the Thunder Caves demonstrated that some phenomena can only be understood through direct experience of the cultural practices that developed around them, challenging traditional boundaries between scientific observation and spiritual practice. The recognition that the Thunder Caves functioned as natural environmental monitoring systems has contributed to new approaches to climate research and weather prediction that incorporate traditional ecological knowledge alongside conventional meteorological techniques. Campbell's work showed that indigenous communities had developed sophisticated understanding of local climate patterns through careful observation of natural acoustic and atmospheric phenomena that modern technology is only beginning to recognize and measure. The most important, Campbell's research demonstrated that the relationship between human consciousness and natural environments is far more complex and interactive than Western science had traditionally assumed. The Thunder Caves showed that certain natural settings can actively enhance human environmental awareness, creating feedback loops between natural phenomena and human perception that challenge simple distinctions between objective natural processes and subjective human experience. Jaita Grotto, Lebanon, echoes from the dawn of civilization. In 1836, American missionary William Thompson was hunting in the hills above Beirut when he made a discovery that would eventually reveal one of the ancient world's most profound acoustic mysteries. Following the sound of rushing water through dense Lebanese cedar forest, Thompson came upon a narrow opening in the limestone cliffs that seemed to exhale cool, humid air, carrying the echo of underground rivers flowing through vast hidden chambers. What he initially assumed was a simple cave entrance would prove to be the gateway to a massive underground system that had been known to ancient civilizations but forgotten by the modern world until his accidental rediscovery. Thompson's initial exploration of what would become known as Jaita Grotto was limited by the primitive equipment available to 19th century cave explorers, but even his first tentative ventures into the upper chambers revealed evidence of ancient human activity that seemed far more sophisticated than simple shelter-seeking or water collection. Carved niches in the cave walls, carefully constructed stone platforms, and what appeared to be deliberate modifications to the cave's natural acoustics suggested that ancient peoples had used these chambers for purposes that went beyond basic survival needs. The American missionary's journal entries from his early explorations describe acoustic phenomena that puzzled him deeply. According to Thompson, voices spoken in certain areas of the cave would echo through the chambers with unusual clarity and duration, while sounds made in other locations seemed to be absorbed by the limestone walls without producing any echo at all. More mysteriously, Thompson reported hearing what sounded like human voices during his solo explorations, conversations that seemed to emanate from deeper chambers that he lacked the equipment to explore safely. Word of Thompson's discovery spread slowly through the scholarly communities of Beirut and Damascus, eventually reaching European archaeologists who were beginning to recognize the importance of cave sites for understanding ancient civilizations. However, the political instability of the Ottoman Empire and the remote location of the grotto meant that systematic archaeological investigation would not begin for several decades. During this delay, local legends began to accumulate around the site, with stories of ancient voices and spiritual presences that seemed to connect the cave to Lebanon's pre-Islamic religious traditions. By the 1870s, Jaita Grotto had attracted the attention of the Beirut-based Palestine Exploration Fund, which commissioned preliminary surveys that confirmed Thompson's observations about the cave's unusual acoustic properties and evidence of ancient human activity. These early archaeological reports described carved symbols on cave walls, stone arrangements that appeared to serve ceremonial functions, and acoustic effects that seemed too sophisticated to be accidental byproducts of natural cave formation. The first systematic archaeological investigation of Jaita Grotto began in 1898 under the direction of French archaeologist Henri Fleisch, who brought modern excavation techniques and photographic documentation to the site. Fleisch's team discovered that the grotto contained not just the upper chambers that Thompson had explored, but an extensive lower cave system accessible only by boat through underground rivers that had carved spectacular galleries through the Lebanese limestone over millions of years. Physical evidence collected during Fleisch's excavations revealed that Jaita Grotto had been used continuously by human civilizations for over 6,000 years, with different periods of activity corresponding to major cultural developments in the ancient Near East. Pottery fragments, carved stone implements, and ceremonial objects suggested that the cave had served religious functions for Phoenician, Roman, and early Christian communities, each group apparently building upon the spiritual traditions established by their predecessors. The acoustic evidence proved particularly intriguing. Fleisch documented that specific areas of the cave had been modified by ancient peoples to enhance sound transmission and create echo effects that could make voices carry across vast underground chambers. Stone platforms had been positioned at locations where the cave's natural acoustics created optimal conditions for sound projection, while carved channels in the limestone walls seemed designed to direct and focus acoustic energy in ways that enhanced the cave's already remarkable sound transmission properties. Historical records from ancient sources provided additional clues about the grotto's significance in regional religious practices. Phoenician texts mentioned sacred caves dedicated to the goddess Astarte, where priests would commune with divine voices that emerged from underground waters. Roman accounts described Lebanese caves where oracles delivered prophecies through acoustic phenomena that seemed to demonstrate supernatural knowledge. Early Christian writings referenced cave shrines, where hermits reported hearing angelic voices providing spiritual guidance through underground chambers. Water played a crucial role in the grotto's acoustic mysteries. The underground rivers that flowed through the lower chambers created complex sound transmission effects as water moved through passages of different dimensions and configurations. Fleisch's team discovered that water levels in the cave system varied seasonally and responded to rainfall patterns in the Lebanese mountains, creating acoustic conditions that changed throughout the year in ways that ancient visitors had apparently learned to interpret and utilize. Temperature and humidity measurements revealed that the grotto maintained remarkably stable environmental conditions that differed significantly from the external Lebanese climate. These consistent atmospheric conditions seemed to enhance the cave's acoustic properties while creating a sense of separation from the ordinary world that would have supported the spiritual practices that historical records attributed to the site. The first major theory proposed to explain Jaita Grotto's acoustic mysteries focused on simple natural cave acoustics, with early 20th century researchers suggesting that the voice phenomena reported by ancient sources and modern visitors were nothing more than conventional echo effects, amplified by the cave's large chambers and limestone walls. This echo theory seemed to provide a rational explanation for historical claims about divine voices and oracular pronouncements, reducing ancient spiritual experiences to misunderstood acoustic physics. However, systematic acoustic testing of the echo theory revealed significant problems. While the grotto did produce conventional echoes in some areas, the voice phenomena that visitors consistently reported were far more complex than simple sound reflection could explain. The mysterious voices seemed to originate from within the cave system, rather than being reflections of sounds made by human visitors, and they often occurred when no one was present to create the original sounds that echoes would require. A second theory attributed the grotto's acoustic effects to water flow through the underground river system, suggesting that moving water created the sounds that ancient peoples interpreted as divine voices. According to this hydraulic theory, different water flow conditions could produce various acoustic effects that might sound like human speech or musical tones, explaining why the cave's acoustic phenomena seem to change with seasonal variations in water level and flow rate. Testing of the water flow theory involved detailed measurements of acoustic output under different hydrological conditions, but the results were inconclusive. While water movement through the cave system did create various sounds, these hydraulic effects couldn't account for the organized patterns and apparent linguistic structure that witnesses reported hearing in the grotto's mysterious voices. The theory also failed to explain why the acoustic phenomena seemed to respond to human presence and activities in ways that simple water flow couldn't account for. The most persistent false lead involved attributing the grotto's mysteries to geological activity, with some researchers proposing that limestone settlement, underground pressure changes, or seismic activity was creating the sounds that visitors interpreted as voices. This geological theory gained support from the observation that Lebanon sits in a seismically active region where underground pressure changes and rock movement could theoretically produce acoustic effects. Seismic monitoring equipment installed in the grotto detected occasional geological activity, but the timing and characteristics of these geological events didn't correlate with the reported acoustic phenomena. The mysterious voices occurred far more frequently than seismic activity would predict, and their acoustic characteristics were too consistent and organized to result from random geological processes. The breakthrough in understanding Jaita Grotto's acoustic mysteries came in the 1970s when advanced recording equipment and acoustic analysis technology were brought to the site by an international team of archaeologists and acoustic engineers. Dr. Antoine Carter from the American University of Beirut collaborated with acoustic specialists from European institutions to conduct the most comprehensive study of the cave's sound transmission properties ever attempted. The key discovery was that Jaita Grotto's limestone formations had been shaped by millions of years of water flow into configurations that created sophisticated acoustic waveguides, natural channels that could carry sound waves across vast distances through the cave system with minimal distortion. These geological waveguides connected different chambers and levels of the grotto, allowing voices and other sounds to travel between areas that appeared to be completely separate when viewed from conventional cave maps. Advanced acoustic mapping revealed that ancient peoples had recognized these natural sound transmission properties and had modified specific areas of the cave to optimize the acoustic effects. Stone platforms, carved channels, and positioned ceremonial objects all corresponded to locations where the cave's natural waveguides created optimal conditions for sound projection and reception. The ancient modifications weren't random religious installations but sophisticated acoustic engineering projects that enhanced the cave's already remarkable sound transmission capabilities. Computer modelling of sound wave propagation through the mapped cave system explained many of the mysterious voice phenomena that had puzzled investigators for over a century. Voices spoken in certain areas of the upper chambers could travel through natural waveguides to emerge in the lower cave system, creating the impression that invisible speakers were present in areas where no human could actually be located. The acoustic paths were so complex that sounds could take several minutes to travel from their origin points to distant chambers, creating time delays that made the voice phenomena seem even more mysterious. Chemical analysis of the limestone formations revealed that Jaita's rock contained mineral compositions that enhanced acoustic reflection and transmission in ways that differed from typical cave limestone. These mineralogical properties, combined with the specific geometric configurations carved by water flow, created acoustic conditions that were uniquely suited to the kind of sophisticated sound manipulation that ancient peoples had apparently learned to utilize for religious and ceremonial purposes. Despite decades of scientific investigation, several aspects of Jaita Grotto's acoustic behavior remain unexplained. The cave occasionally produces voice phenomena that don't correspond to any identifiable sound source within the cave system, suggesting acoustic mechanisms that current theories don't fully account for. These unexplained voices often occur during periods when no visitors are present in the cave, yet recording equipment captures clear human speech that seems to originate from within the grotto itself. The relationship between the grotto's acoustic phenomena and external environmental conditions is more complex than current models predict. While seasonal changes in water flow and atmospheric pressure do influence the cave's sound transmission properties, the specific patterns of acoustic enhancement don't always match theoretical predictions based on known physical principles. Some of the clearest voice phenomena occur during atmospheric conditions that should actually reduce acoustic transmission within the cave system. The grotto's acoustic properties also change over longer time periods in ways that can't be fully explained by known geological or hydrological processes. Comparison of acoustic measurements taken decades apart shows gradual changes in the cave's sound transmission characteristics that might be related to ongoing limestone formation, mineral deposition, or subtle shifts in underground watercourses. These long-term acoustic changes suggest that Jaita's mysterious properties may continue to evolve in ways that make the cave's acoustic behavior difficult to predict or fully understand. Perhaps most mysteriously, some visitors continue to report hearing voices that seem to demonstrate knowledge of historical events, religious practices, and cultural information that wouldn't be available through normal acoustic transmission of contemporary conversations. These anomalous voice phenomena include discussions of ancient religious practices, references to historical figures from Lebanon's past, and conversations in archaic forms of Arabic, Aramaic, and other regional languages that few modern speakers would recognize. Modern acoustic monitoring equipment occasionally detects organized sound patterns within the grotto that don't match any known source of acoustic energy, including human voices, water flow, geological activity, or equipment noise, leaving researchers with the intriguing possibility that Lebanon's most spectacular cave system continues to harbor acoustic secrets that connect the ancient world's spiritual practices with natural phenomena that contemporary science is still working to fully understand and explain. Luray Caverns, USA, the great Stalacpipe organ's hidden symphony. The journey to Luray Caverns begins in the rolling hills of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, where centuries of rainfall have carved the Blue Ridge limestone into one of America's most extensive cave systems. The approach to the caverns follows winding country roads that pass through farmland and forest, giving no hint of the vast underground chambers that lie beneath the pastoral landscape. Local residents have long known that something unusual existed beneath their feet, wells that produced strange echoes, sinkholes that seemed to breathe with the changing seasons, and areas where the ground itself seemed to resonate with hidden vibrations. The modern entrance to Luray Caverns was carved through solid limestone in the 1880s, but the natural openings that originally provided access to the underground system tell a different story. These natural entrances, now sealed for safety and conservation reasons, were known to Native American peoples who used the caves for shelter and ceremony. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous communities recognized the cave's unusual acoustic properties and incorporated them into spiritual practices that involved communication with what they believed were earth spirits dwelling in the deepest chambers. The temperature differential between the surface and cave environments is immediately noticeable during the approach. Even on the hottest Virginia summer days, cool air flows from cave openings, creating microclimates that support plant species typically found much farther north. This temperature difference creates air currents that early explorers noticed seem to carry sounds in unusual ways, with voices and equipment noise from deep within the cave sometimes audible at surface openings hundreds of yards away. The limestone formations visible at the surface provide clues about the extraordinary geological processes that created Luray's underground chambers. The rock contains fossils from ancient sea creatures that lived when this region was covered by warm, shallow oceans millions of years ago. These fossils include coral formations and shell deposits that contribute to the cave's unique acoustic properties, with different mineral compositions creating surfaces that reflect and absorb sound waves in ways that vary throughout the cave system. Local folklore surrounding Luray Caverns includes stories that date back generations, describing underground music that could be heard by farmers working fields above the cave system. These accounts speak of melodies that seem to emerge from the earth itself, particularly during storms when atmospheric pressure changes apparently activated acoustic phenomena within the cave. Some families passed down specific locations where the underground music was most audible, creating informal maps of surface areas where the hidden cave system's acoustic activity could be detected. The first documented exploration of Luray Caverns took place on August 13, 1878, when local residents Benton Stebbins, Andrew Campbell, William Campbell, and Philip Long discovered the cave entrance while searching for a rumoured underground lake that local legends claimed existed beneath the valley. Armed with candles and rope, the four men descended into what they initially assumed would be a modest limestone cave, but quickly realised was something far more extraordinary than their small Virginia community had ever imagined. The initial chambers of Luray Caverns revealed formations of stunning beauty: flowstone cascades, crystal pools, and stalactite formations that seemed to defy gravity in their delicate complexity. However, what struck the first explorers most powerfully was not the visual spectacle but the acoustic environment they encountered. Every footstep, whispered conversation, and drip of water created sounds that seemed to be amplified and modified by the cave's architecture in ways that made normal human activities sound like performances in a vast underground concert hall. The discoverers quickly realized that different areas of the cave possessed dramatically different acoustic properties. Some chambers created cathedral-like reverb that made their voices seem to gain depth and richness, while others absorbed sound so completely that normal conversation became difficult, even between people standing close together. Most mysteriously, certain formations seemed to generate their own sounds, musical tones that occurred without any apparent human cause and harmonic patterns that suggested the cave itself was capable of producing organized music. As the initial exploration continued deeper into the cave system, the acoustic phenomena became more pronounced and puzzling. The explorers reported hearing what sounded like organ music coming from areas of the cave they hadn't yet explored, melodies that seemed too complex and sustained to be produced by simple water drips or air movement. When they investigated the sources of these sounds, they found chambers containing formations that appeared to be vibrating in response to air currents and atmospheric pressure changes, creating the musical tones they had been hearing. The discovery that would eventually transform Luray Caverns into one of America's most famous tourist attractions occurred when the explorers found themselves in a vast chamber containing limestone formations that clearly functioned as natural musical instruments. Stalactites of different sizes and compositions produced different tones when struck, while flowstone formations created resonant surfaces that could amplify and sustain musical notes. The chamber seemed designed by nature to serve as a concert hall, complete with acoustic properties that rivaled the finest human-built performance spaces. As expeditions pushed deeper into Luray's limestone labyrinth, the cave's acoustic mysteries became increasingly complex and difficult to explain through conventional understanding of cave acoustics. Explorers discovered that sounds made in one chamber could be heard clearly in distant areas of the cave system, through acoustic pathways that didn't correspond to any visible passages or air currents. Voices seemed to travel through solid limestone walls, creating the impression that the rock itself was conducting sound in ways that violated normal acoustic principles. The cave's response to atmospheric pressure changes became more pronounced in the deeper chambers. During storms, when barometric pressure dropped rapidly, the entire cave system seemed to become acoustically active, with formations throughout the underground network producing musical tones that created natural symphonies lasting for hours. These pressure-activated concerts suggested that Luray functioned as a massive barometric instrument, converting atmospheric changes into organized sound that could be heard throughout the cave system. Temperature variations within the deep chambers created additional acoustic mysteries. Different areas of the cave maintained significantly different temperatures, despite being at similar depths and having similar limestone compositions. These temperature differences created air currents that flowed through the cave in patterns that seemed designed to activate specific formations at precise times, creating musical sequences that suggested intentional composition rather than random acoustic effects. Water played an increasingly important role as explorations continued into the cave's deepest accessible areas. Underground streams and pools reflected and modified sounds in ways that created echo effects lasting for minutes after the original sounds were made. More mysteriously, the water seemed to generate its own acoustic phenomena, with underground rivers producing rhythmic patterns that resembled percussion instruments, and pools creating tonal effects that varied with water level and mineral content. The limestone formations themselves became more acoustically active at greater depths. Stalactites and stalagmites seemed to respond to human presence by producing faint musical tones, while flowstone formations created surfaces that vibrated sympathetically with sounds made elsewhere in the cave. Some formations appeared to store acoustic energy, continuing to produce musical tones long after the sounds that initially excited them had faded away. In the deepest accessible chamber of Luray Caverns, nearly 200 feet below the surface, explorers discovered what would become known as the location of the Great Stalacpipe Organ, a natural formation that represents one of the most remarkable acoustic phenomena ever found in an American cave system. This chamber contains limestone formations that function as a complete musical instrument, capable of producing organized compositions that seem to demonstrate intentional musical structure rather than random acoustic effects. The stalacpipe organ chamber contains dozens of limestone formations that have been shaped by millions of years of water flow into precise configurations that produce specific musical tones when activated by air currents, atmospheric pressure changes, or direct contact. These natural pipes range in size from massive columns that produce deep bass tones to delicate formations that create high-pitched melodies, providing a complete range of musical frequencies that can be combined to create complex harmonic compositions. What makes this deepest chamber particularly mysterious is the apparent coordination between different formations in producing musical sequences. Rather than generating random acoustic effects, the limestone instruments seem to respond to each other's sounds, creating call and response patterns and harmonic progressions that suggest some form of acoustic communication between different parts of the chamber. This coordination creates the impression that the cave itself possesses musical intelligence capable of composing and performing original compositions. The acoustic properties of the stalacpipe organ chamber are enhanced by the presence of underground water that acts as both a sound conductor and a resonance chamber. Pools of water at different levels reflect and modify the musical tones produced by the limestone formations, creating complex echo effects and harmonic interactions that add layers of sophistication to the chamber's musical output. The water seems to function as a natural mixing board, balancing and blending the different acoustic elements to create unified musical compositions. During certain atmospheric conditions, the stalacpipe organ chamber becomes spontaneously active, producing musical performances that can last for hours without any human intervention. These natural concerts seem to be triggered by specific combinations of barometric pressure, temperature, and humidity that create optimal conditions for the limestone formations to vibrate and produce sound. The resulting music includes melodic themes, harmonic progressions, and rhythmic patterns that seem too sophisticated to be produced by simple physical processes. The ascent from Luray's deepest chambers brings explorers back through acoustic environments that now seem ordinary compared to the extraordinary musical phenomena they experienced in the cave's heart. However, the journey back to the surface reveals that the entire cave system functions as an integrated acoustic network, with sounds from the deepest chambers carrying upward through limestone passages to influence the acoustic environment of chambers closer to the surface. Visitors emerging from extended stays in Luray's deepest chambers consistently report enhanced acoustic sensitivity that persists for days or weeks after their underground experience. They describe being able to hear subtle environmental sounds with unusual clarity and being more sensitive to musical harmony and acoustic relationships in their normal surface environment. Some report continuing to hear faint echoes of the cave's music during quiet moments, as if their consciousness retains acoustic memories of the underground musical experience. The acoustic equipment and instruments brought into Luray's depths often exhibit unusual behaviour after exposure to the cave's deepest acoustic phenomena. Electronic devices sometimes continue to detect sound frequencies that weren't present during surface testing, while mechanical instruments show changes in their acoustic response characteristics that suggest modification by prolonged exposure to the cave's unique acoustic environment. Scientific analysis of recordings made in Luray's deepest chambers reveals acoustic information that doesn't correspond to any identifiable sound sources within the cave system. The recordings contain musical phrases, harmonic progressions, and rhythmic patterns that seem too complex and organized to be produced by the known physical processes operating within the cave. These anomalous recordings suggest that Luray's acoustic environment may be more complex than current scientific understanding can explain. Modern visitors to Luray Caverns continue to report spontaneous musical experiences in the cave's deepest accessible areas, with accounts that match the descriptions recorded by the cave's original discoverers over a century ago. The Stalak pipe organ chamber continues to produce natural musical performances that demonstrate the same sophisticated, harmonic relationships and melodic development that first amazed 19th century explorers, suggesting that whatever creates Luray's acoustic mysteries represents a stable, ongoing natural phenomenon rather than temporary geological activity. Carlsbad Caves, USA, where ancient spirits meet natural science. Long before the first European settlers set foot in the American Southwest, the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico knew about the caves that cried. For over 1,000 years, the ancestors of today's Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo tribes spoke in hushed tones about the sacred caverns hidden beneath the Guadalupe Mountains. They called them the Weeping Stone Mothers, places where the earth itself mourned for reasons only the spirits understood. The oral traditions passed down through generations painted these caves as portals between worlds. Tribal elders would tell stories around flickering fires, about how the voices belonged to ancient spirits trapped between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. These weren't ghost stories meant to frighten children. They were sacred teachings, part of a complex spiritual framework that governed how the people interacted with the natural world around them. According to Pueblo tradition, the crying voices emerged during times of great change or upheaval, when drought threatened the crops, when enemies approached from distant lands, or when the balance between human beings and nature grew unstable. The stone mothers would weep. Their tears, the elders explained, weren't made of water but of sound itself, mournful calls that echoed through the underground chambers as warnings to those who knew how to listen. The tribes developed elaborate ceremonies around these phenomena. Special shamans, known as cave listeners, would undertake dangerous journeys into the upper chambers of the cave systems during certain seasons. Armed only with offerings of corn pollen, turquoise, and sacred feathers, these spiritual guides would descend into the darkness to commune with the voices. They would return with prophecies, guidance for the community, and sometimes troubling warnings about events yet to come. What made these traditions particularly significant was their specificity. The Pueblo peoples didn't simply describe generic supernatural voices. Their oral histories contained detailed descriptions of the acoustic properties of different chambers, the times of year when the phenomena were strongest, and even the emotional qualities of different types of cries. Some voices, they said, carried the sorrow of mothers who had lost children. Others held the regret of warriors who had fallen in battle far from home. Still others seemed to carry messages from the plant and animal spirits that shared the high desert landscape. The cave listeners developed a sophisticated understanding of which chambers produced which types of voices. They mapped the underground networks not with modern surveying tools, but through generations of careful observation and spiritual practice. They knew that certain passages amplified human whispers into otherworldly wails. They understood that temperature changes affected the intensity of the phenomena. Most importantly, they recognized that the caves required respect, ritual preparation, and spiritual protection to enter safely. The first documented encounter between these ancient beliefs and the outside world came in 1898, when a cattle rancher named Samuel McKittrick was tracking stray livestock through the rugged canyons of what would later become Carlsbad Caverns National Park. McKittrick had heard rumours from his Mexican ranch hands about caves that made strange noises, but he dismissed these stories as superstition mixed with too much tequila after long days in the saddle. That changed on a particularly still evening in late October. McKittrick was making camp near a limestone outcropping when he heard what he later described in his diary as the most mournful sound ever to reach human ears. The noise seemed to emerge from the rocks themselves, a low, keening wail that rose and fell like a woman in grief. McKittrick, a practical man who had survived cattle drives, Indian raids and flash floods, found himself paralysed with an inexplicable fear. Over the following weeks, McKittrick returned to the area repeatedly, always at dusk, always alone. He began to hear multiple voices, sometimes overlapping, sometimes responding to each other across what seemed like vast underground distances. He attempted to locate the source of the sounds, but found only small openings in the limestone that were too narrow for a grown man to enter. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Word of McKittrick's discovery spread slowly through the scattered ranching communities of southeastern New Mexico. Most of his neighbours reacted with the same mixture of skepticism and unease that would characterise outside responses to the phenomena for decades to come. Some suggested that McKittrick was hearing wind through unusual rock formations. Others theorised that underground rivers or trapped animals might explain the sounds. A few whispered that the isolation of ranch life had finally gotten to the old cowboy's mind. The local Mexican and Native American ranch workers responded quite differently. Many nodded knowingly when they heard McKittrick's descriptions. Some shared their own family stories about similar phenomena in other parts of the Southwest. A few offered to guide McKittrick to tribal elders who might help him understand what he was experiencing. McKittrick, raised in the cultural certainties of late 19th century America, politely declined these offers while privately struggling to make sense of experiences that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The situation became more complicated when McKittrick's teenage nephew, visiting from back east, also heard the voices. The boy, educated in the latest scientific thinking of the day, was initially determined to find a rational explanation. He spent hours exploring the area with makeshift recording equipment, an early phonograph cylinder player that his father had sent as a novelty. What he captured on those primitive recordings would later become some of the first documented evidence of the Carlsbad Crying Caves phenomena. When McKittrick's nephew brought his phonograph recordings to the Territorial University in Albuquerque, the academic response was swift and dismissive. Professor James Weatherby, head of the geology department, listened to the crackling recordings for exactly 3 minutes before declaring them obvious hoaxes perpetrated by local pranksters with too much time and too little education. The scientific establishment of the early 1900s had little patience for unexplained phenomena, particularly those associated with what they considered primitive superstitions. The emerging disciplines of geology, archaeology, and anthropology were fighting hard to establish their credibility as legitimate sciences. Claims about mysterious voices in caves sounded uncomfortably similar to the ghost stories and folk tales that serious academics were trying to distance themselves from. Dr. Margaret Chen, one of the few female researchers working in the Southwest at the time, took a slightly different approach. As an anthropologist studying Pueblo cultures, she had encountered numerous references to the Crying Caves in her interviews with tribal elders. While she didn't necessarily believe in supernatural explanations, she recognized that consistent cultural narratives often contain kernels of observable truth. Chen proposed that a small research expedition visit the area to document whatever natural phenomena might be underlying the local legends. The university administrators rejected Chen's proposal immediately. They argued that using institutional resources to investigate Indian superstitions would damage the university's reputation and credibility. The territorial government, eager to attract Eastern investment and development, was similarly uninterested in anything that might make New Mexico seem backward or mysterious. The official position became that the crying caves were nothing more than wind patterns and acoustic illusions amplified by local folklore and wishful thinking. This dismissive attitude persisted even as more reports filtered in from the area. Railroad surveyors working on plans for a southern route through the Guadalupe Mountains reported hearing unexplained voices near certain limestone formations. Telegraph operators manning remote stations claimed that some nights they could hear crying sounds that seemed to come through the ground itself, interfering with their equipment. Cowboys, miners, and settlers throughout the region began sharing similar stories, always with the same defensive tone that suggested they knew their experiences wouldn't be taken seriously. The scientific community's rejection of these reports created a strange cultural divide. Local knowledge about the caves became something that people shared in private but rarely discussed in public. Newspapers occasionally ran sensationalized stories about haunted caves and ghostly voices, but these articles were written in the breathless style of entertainment rather than serious investigation. The phenomena became associated with tourism promotion rather than genuine inquiry, which only strengthened academic reluctance to take the report seriously. Meanwhile, the cave listeners among the Pueblo peoples continued their traditional practices, but they became increasingly secretive about their activities. Government policies aimed at suppressing Native American religious practices made public discussion of the caves dangerous for tribal members. The ancient knowledge went underground, preserved in whispered conversations and private ceremonies while the outside world debated whether the phenomena existed at all. The first crack in the wall of scientific skepticism came in 1923, when a team of geologists from the Smithsonian Institution arrived in the area to study the extensive cave systems that were being developed into what would become Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Dr. Robert Niemeyer, the expedition leader, had read the old reports about crying voices but considered them irrelevant to his mission of mapping and cataloguing the underground formations. That changed during their third week of exploration. Niemeyer and his team were conducting acoustic measurements in one of the deeper chambers when they heard what Niemeyer later described as unmistakably human vocalizations with no identifiable human source. The sounds came in waves, sometimes lasting for minutes at a time, echoing through passages that the team had already confirmed were empty of people or animals. Unlike previous visitors, Niemeyer's team had sophisticated equipment for measuring and recording sound. They captured hours of audio using the latest acoustic recording technology, and more importantly, they documented the precise conditions under which the phenomena occurred. Temperature readings, humidity levels, barometric pressure, wind speeds, and even the position of the moon were all carefully noted and correlated with the appearance of the voices. The data revealed patterns that no one had expected. The voices appeared most frequently during periods of atmospheric pressure change, particularly when storm systems were moving through the region. They were strongest in chambers with specific geometric properties, high ceilings, narrow passages, and particular relationships between chamber volume and opening size. Most significantly, the team discovered that the voices seemed to be produced by air movement through the cave system, but in ways that shouldn't have been possible according to existing understanding of cave acoustics. Dr. Sarah Whitfield, the team's acoustic specialist, made the breakthrough discovery. She realized that the Carlsbad Cave system was acting as a massive natural organ pipe. Changes in surface air pressure created pressure differentials that forced air through the underground passages at specific velocities. The geometry of certain chambers created resonant frequencies that mimicked human vocal patterns, while the natural limestone formations acted as acoustic filters that shaped these sounds into what listeners interpreted as voices, crying, or singing. But Whitfield's discovery raised as many questions as it answered. The acoustic properties required to produce such realistic vocal sounds were extraordinarily rare. The cave system would need to have evolved specific geometric relationships that were precisely tuned to create these effects. When Whitfield calculated the statistical probability of such a formation occurring naturally, the numbers were so small as to be virtually impossible. The mystery deepened when the team began comparing their recordings with the oral traditions collected by earlier anthropologists. The Pueblo descriptions of the voices' emotional qualities corresponded exactly with the acoustic characteristics that Whitfield's measurements revealed. The tribal knowledge about which chambers produced which types of sounds proved to be completely accurate. Most remarkably, the traditional timing for the cave listener ceremonies aligned perfectly with the atmospheric conditions that produced the strongest vocal phenomena. The collision between ancient understanding and modern science at Carlsbad ultimately produced something neither tradition could have achieved alone. The Pueblo peoples had developed sophisticated observational knowledge about the cave's behavior, but they lacked the technical tools to understand the underlying physical mechanisms. Western science had the instruments and analytical methods to explain the phenomena, but without the traditional knowledge, researchers might never have known what to look for or when to look for it. The collaboration that emerged, though slow and sometimes difficult, proved remarkably productive. Tribal elders began working with acoustic researchers to map the relationship between traditional knowledge and scientific measurements. Cave listeners shared detailed observations about how different weather patterns affected the voices, providing crucial data for understanding the atmospheric triggers that activated the cave's acoustic properties. In return, scientific explanations helped tribal communities understand why their ancestors had been drawn to these particular caves and why the phenomena behaved in such predictable patterns. The modern understanding that emerged painted a picture of extraordinary natural precision. The Carlsbad Cave system represented millions of years of geological evolution that had, through pure chance, created the conditions necessary for this remarkable acoustic phenomenon. The limestone formations had been carved by ancient underground rivers into shapes that functioned as natural voice synthesizers. The multiple levels and interconnected chambers created acoustic feedback loops that amplified and modified sounds in ways that mimicked human emotional expression. Yet the statistical improbability of such formation raised profound questions about the relationship between natural processes and human perception. Did the caves really produce sounds that resembled human voices, or did human brains interpret certain frequencies and patterns as vocal because of deep evolutionary programming? The question became not just about acoustics and geology, but about consciousness itself and how humans create meaning from sensory experience. The synthesis of traditional knowledge and scientific understanding also revealed the sophisticated ecological awareness embedded in Pueblo traditions. The cave listeners hadn't just been responding to supernatural voices, they'd been monitoring a natural barometer that reflected atmospheric and seasonal changes, affecting the entire high desert ecosystem. The crying voices served as early warning systems for weather patterns that could impact crops, water supplies, and the movements of game animals. What outsiders had dismissed as primitive superstition was actually a complex environmental monitoring system that had helped communities survive in a challenging landscape for over a millennium. Modern research continues to uncover new layers of complexity in the Carlsbad phenomena. Recent studies using advanced acoustic modelling have revealed that the cave system responds to seismic activity, changes in groundwater levels, and even subtle variations in surface temperature. The voices that once seemed mysterious and supernatural now serve as sensitive indicators of environmental conditions throughout the entire Guadalupe Mountains ecosystem. Scientists have learned to read the cave's acoustic signatures like a detailed weather report, while tribal elders share knowledge about interpreting the emotional content of different vocal patterns. We have descended through 3 hours of darkness, from sacred caverns to forgotten depths, across underground realms that hold more secrets than science can explain. Each story we've encountered is an echo in the endless chambers of subterranean mystery, reminding us that despite all our equipment and theories, the Earth's hidden places remain fundamentally unknowable. The cave listeners have grown silent, the ancient voices have faded into legend, and the missing explorers remain forever lost in stone passages. Yet their stories persist, passed from generation to generation, because they speak to something essential about our relationship with the depths beneath our feet. As darkness falls and another expedition begins, one truth endures. Somewhere down there in the blackness, beyond the reach of our lights and instruments, the Earth continues its ancient work of creating mysteries that will outlive us all.